Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, and this is going to be finishing off my solo series on the cosmological argument. Finally, part 5 is here, and this is where I go over the most controversial premise in my cosmological argument, or my argument from contingency, which is a Leibnizian version of the cosmological argument. So I'm excited to finally get into the warrant for premise 3 of my argument. So if you remember, I presented my Leibnizian cosmological argument, or our argument from the contingency of the universe, had 3 main premises, kind of piggybacking off of Stephen T. Davis's version, or that's the version that Dr. William Lane Craig uses in his arguments and debates and that sort of thing. So I've sort of modified it. So if you remember premise 1 on your screen, the universe, and or the universe plus, defined as all of space and time and its contents, exists contingently, or in other words, it's a contingent existing thing. And we spent the first 4 videos that we did, about 12 hours, parts 1 and 2, as well as parts 3a and 3b, proving that this premise is true, that the universe does in fact exist as a contingent existing thing. And then in last time, with part 4, we went over premise 2, and that's where we established the principle of sufficient reason, our version of it, as an general explanatory principle in answering the Glendower problem. So if you remember, there are 4 or 5, really there's 5 main criticisms or objections that any atheist or skeptic can give to any traditional cosmological argument. So the first relates to premise 1. That's where we're establishing the cosmic feature that needs an explanation. In our case, it's the contingent existence of the universe. That's our feature or fact at the cosmic level of the universe itself that we're trying to explain. And a skeptic or an atheist can simply deny that that cosmic fact exists, right? So other versions of the argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, the cosmic fact is, well, the universe began to exist. So that needs a cause or an explanation. Otherwise, the universe just exists, without specifying that it exists contingently. That's another cosmic feature. Or there's cosmological arguments based on all facts and stuff like that. Alexander Proust goes into arguments of that nature and that sort of thing. So that's the first objection. We overcame that with premise 1. We proved that the universe does in fact exist, and it exists contingently, and therefore, with premise 2, then the second problem is that Glendower problem. Okay, so you prove this cosmic feature exists, but so what? It doesn't necessarily need a cause or need an explanation, does it? And that's where we posit our principle of sufficient reason as premise 2, to answer that with the general explanatory principle, namely, quote unquote, generally speaking, every existing thing, whether contingent or necessary, including the universe, has a sufficient explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own internal nature or in some external cause. And we established that in the part 4 video, the truth of this premise. Now obviously there's a third option we'll get into in this part 5 here. Self-Causation might be an option here, and I didn't cover that in the part 4 video here, so I'll cover that in this video, part 5. Could the universe be self-caused? Is there a third option here? And I'm going to say no. Premise 2 establishes that that's not possible, but we'll cover that here in premise 3. So the 3 remaining problems have to be covered in this one. So the 3 remaining problems to a traditional cosmological argument are the Taxi Cab Fallacy. Remember, we scolded atheists and skeptics who kind of biasly just abandon a causal principle, either a local, so a local causal principle just applies to things that aren't eternal, causal chains that aren't eternal. So for example, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The Kalam cosmological argument premise, that's an example. William Lane Craig is using a local causal principle. Dr. Alexander Proust, he provides 2 non-local causal principles for his Leibnizian cosmological arguments. So those just apply to eternal or infinite, actually infinite causal chains, supposing those could exist. Or there's the way that we go with some kind of general explanatory principle. We need an ultimate explanation and that sort of thing. So that's what premise 2 is about. Now, premise 3, as I said, that's where we tackle the taxi cab fallacy problem. And obviously, atheists and skeptics can't abandon these causal principles or explanatory principles at the level of the universe just arbitrarily because, oh, shoot, everything has a cause except the universe. I'm just going to biasly assert and assume that the universe doesn't have an explanation. And we kind of mop the floor with atheists who kind of biasly say this in our last show, showing that that's complete rubbish. Well, now the shoe's on the other foot. Well, what about you, Mr. Theist? You want to posit that God is the explanation or the cause, or that the God one hypothesis is the ultimate explanation of the universe's contingent existence. That principle, that PSR principle, applies to God too. How do we respond to that? That's a problem. Are we abandoning our PSR when it comes to God or not? How do we deal with that? And we're going to get into that. The fourth problem for premise that's covered under premise 3 is going to be the infinite regress problem. And we've kind of already addressed that in our warrant for premise 1. We're going to be reusing some of the philosophical arguments there that prove that it's impossible, logically impossible, for an actual infinite to exist. But we've got some other argumentation against infinite regress of causes. One cause, going back infinitely into the past, actually infinite, or regress of causes and effects over past eternity and that sort of thing. That's a problem. So how do we address that? How do we address this infinite regress problem? And at that point, I'll probably throw in the issue of what about self-causation as well, just because that seems to fit there. And then finally, we have the all-important gap problem. Great, you can prove there's a necessary ultimate explanation of the universe. That doesn't get you God. How do we get God and or the truth of the God one hypothesis from that? So that's the plan for today's show. Just before I start getting into that, by ways of announcement, so obviously this is finally finishing off my solo series on the cosmological argument in this Existence of God series. Based on my talking with people, I do want to provide another summary of this cosmological argument. So in 1 hour or less, it's a popular level summarization of this argument that I've been giving over the past months in fuller detail in these longer videos. But just for people, I want to give people the option if they would prefer a popular level kind of summary and that sort of thing. I want to try and get that video up at some point after part 5 here soon. And I'm hoping to, with my skeptical co-host Travis R. Obviously he's going through some personal issues right now. I'm not going to, spread his business and that sort of thing. But if he's up for it, if he is up for it, I'd like to do a dialogue with him on this argument specifically, because I learn a lot from him. He's a smart guy. He's open-minded. So yeah, if he's up for it, then we'll have a discussion on this cosmological argument and see what he thinks of it, and we'll go back and forth on the argument presented. Outside of that, I'm going to be starting up school in the fall, and my supervisor wants me to start up doing my thesis paper in August rather than just starting in the fall. So unfortunately, that's going to take away some time from doing what I wanted to do, but in terms of guest shows, but I'll still try to throw in some new shows and that sort of thing every now and then, as best as I can. I have reached out to some guests. I do have the Shroud Wars coming up on the historical evidence for the Shroud with Dr. Cheryl White and Hugh Ferry, and I have some other ideas, as well as another guest reached out to me by email, so we'll see if I can fit that in. But other than that, I do want to try and fit in, before I go to the next argument for God's existence, the next argument I want to look at is the modal ontological argument, the one that I think of the objective arguments is the best and proves the most in terms of proving God's existence. But I did have one person in the audience mention, well, can you also address arguments for atheism? And rather than separating it all out, I'm actually going to include some of these arguments in my presentation of the positive arguments. So with the modal ontological argument, that'll allow me to cover the argument for atheism from the internal incoherence of God as a concept. Because obviously, in order to say, well, it's possible that God exists, as per the modal ontological argument's first premise, it has to be a coherent concept. So that's a perfect opportunity to kind of throw in that atheistic argument at the same time as proving the ontological argument. As well, with ontological arguments, there's one of the four main objections to that kind of argument are obviously parodies. And I've been studying through my area readings, I've kind of become a mini expert on the evil God challenge. So I've always thought that the parody of the maximal evil being, well, it's possible that a maximal evil being can exist, and this can defeat the modal ontological argument, because via the same argument, just plugging that in, instead of maximal great, we have maximal evil being. We can prove a maximal evil being exists, and that's logically absurd because we have a contradiction. So I'm going to throw in my research into the evil God challenge as part of my explanation in proving the modal ontological argument. So I fitted in two arguments for atheism there within one presentation of the ontological argument. That's the plan anyways. And then I'll get into two other arguments as we go. But that's the next few arguments that I want to get into. Before I get into that, though, that'll probably take me some time to post up. Someone asked me for the Jesus Mythicism series that I haven't done a show on since 2019. So I want to get a quick couple, one or two episodes up on that before I start getting hardcore back into the Existence of God series. So that'll probably be on the remaining external evidences, and possibly if I do another episode, it would be on the negative evidences, the evidences presented by mythicists like Richard Carrier that positively claim to prove Jesus didn't exist as a historical figure. So that's my plan of action. Okay, I've been talking too long. I'm going to shut up, and we can get straight into the assessment of premise 3 here. Now, just a quick note before we do that, actually. Sorry. So I'm one last thing to say. Again, I recorded large bits of this, the majority of this show, a lot of this show 2 years ago, back in 2019, and back then I was I was making a different argument, a pure Leibnizian argument based on the existence of the universe, so not the contingent existence of the universe. I don't want you to get confused there. I've tried to make edits throughout to fix up some of those issues, but I wasn't able to get all of them because it's very time consuming to have to edit a show once it's already recorded and that sort of thing. In Audacity, it takes forever. But I did try to make some edits to fix up some of those issues. But yeah, just so you're aware, if there are bits where I'm reflecting the older version of the argument, just try not to get confused. I think that you can get past it and understand what's being said, as long as you bear in mind, remember the updated argument about the contingent existence of the universe, not just the existence of the universe and that sort of thing. But for the most part, I don't think, with what I've got here, I don't think you guys will get confused. So let's get into the most famous premise 3 now. And this is the most controversial of the premises. This is where most atheists and skeptics will object to it. Saying if the universe exists, then that explanation is God, or what I call God, quote unquote, God 1. Matt Dillahunty, this is the premise he objects to. This is obviously the hardest premise to provide warrant for. So yeah, let's start to get into it and assess this premise here. Okay, so with premise 3, this basically says if the universe has a sufficient explanation of its existence, that explanation is God 1. Or God. Hopefully that will arrive at when we finish our total analysis of all the evidences, positive and negative, for God's existence, or the truth of the God final hypothesis. Now, with premise 3 of the Leibnizian argument here, we've got premise 2 established. There is a principle of sufficient reason, and it does apply to the universe in particular. The universe has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own internal nature, or in an external cause or series of causes, cause and effects. And ultimately, we want to say that that is the God 1 hypothesis that explains the existence of the universe. Here in this section, we have to overcome at least 3 problems or hurdles in order to make our Leibnizian cosmological argument successful. Remember, with premise 2, we've overcome the Glendower problem. But now we have to overcome the infinite regress problem, the taxi cab fallacy problem, and the gap problem. So in the first place, we know that the universe has to have an explanation of its existence. So how would we go about warranting the truth of that premise, that explanation is in fact God 1? Well, Stephen T. Davis and William Lane Craig have adopted kind of a shortcut method to argue for this without having to put in the work of warranting the premise directly. They just sort of turn it around on the atheist and say, hey, Mr. Atheist, you quite foolishly claim that if atheism is true, that the universe doesn't have an explanation. So, okay, I'm going to be pragmatic. I don't have to do any work. You, the atheist, have foolishly done all the work for me, because we've proven that the universe does have an explanation through premise 2, and therefore, through logical equivalence, if we have the claim that if atheism is true, the universe has no explanation, that's logically equivalent to saying, well, if the universe does have an explanation, as premise 2 proves it does, then that proves that God exists. And obviously, when we say atheism, it could be an anti-theism or non-theism. It's a positive claim that God doesn't or probably doesn't exist. That's what we're talking about here. Non-theism, anti-theism, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, this would work, right? This is sort of a pragmatic shortcut that short circuits any need for me to come up with positive warrant to justify this premise, and it just says, well, you atheists already accept it. So therefore, yeah, boom, we've destroyed you skeptics. We've proven God is real. Now, obviously, this line of argumentation isn't good enough. It's not it's not direct warrant for the truth of the premise. I'm going to say it's a failure because it relies upon the atheist already accepting that claim. And as Matt Dillahunty says in the video, that's just a bald assertion. I don't accept that. I don't believe that if atheism is true, that the universe has no explanation. No, I think that atheism can be true and the universe does have an explanation. So yeah, I actually don't like this way of arguing. I don't think it's a good argument, at least in the absence of any warrant or justification for the original claim that on atheism, the universe would exist inexplicably. You have to prove that that's true. Then you can use the logical equivalence and flip it around to say, well, since we know the universe does have an explanation, that proves it's God. So yeah, if there's an atheist that actually has warrant for their claim, if you can find an atheist who doesn't just blindly believe this is true, but actually has warrant and can provide warrant that on atheism the universe exists inexplicably, well, then you got him. Then you can destroy that skeptic, flip it around, and prove premise 2 is true, and then bada boom, bada bing, you've got God existing. But yeah, for our purposes, that hasn't been warranted, so I'm not going to use this form of argument. It more, without that warrant for that original atheistic claim, it's just a pragmatic argument. You can use it and try to, as a tactic to trick an atheist. Well, do you accept that? If he says yeah, then okay, then you got him. But yeah, we have to do better than that. We have to directly warrant our premise 3 ourselves. So yeah, let's start getting into that. How would we go about warranting the truth of premise 3? Okay, so before we get into addressing the gap problem directly, with premise 3, when we posit that God exists, or God is the explanation of the contingent universe, the contingent existence of the universe, or at the very least, the truth of the God 1 hypothesis is the ultimate explanation of the contingent existence of the universe, we have to overcome those 3 problems, and the first of which is the taxi cab fallacy. We can't abandon our explanatory principle when it comes to our explanation, God, or the God 1 hypothesis. So yeah, how do we address this? Are we arbitrarily abandoning our PSR, our principle of sufficient reason, when it comes to God? Well, no, the answer is absolutely no. Remember, there are 2 options here. It has a sufficient explanation or reason for its existence, either in the internal necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Well, God doesn't have, isn't externally caused by anything. He exists a se by definition, so everything exists by him. So no, we're applying the principle. He is internally necessary. That explains his existence. So we are applying consistently and systematically the principle of sufficient reason as we've laid out here. And or remember, we also offered a watered down version because some skeptics might object to explanations, necessary explanations, and how they work and that sort of thing. So we said, okay, well, even forgetting about that, we can prove the universe exists contingently, and we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the principle of sufficient reason, watered down in a very weak form, just saying that all contingent things have an explanation of their sufficient reason for their existence in an external cause. Well, again, we wouldn't be, even if we went with that, we wouldn't be committing the taxi cab fallacy, because God's outside of that. God is said to be a necessarily existent being. Therefore, the principle of sufficient reason, watered down to only cover contingent things, wouldn't apply to him. But as we're stating it in our argument, because I don't see any issue with necessary and positing necessary beings or entities, the PSR gives two options. Either something exists in the internal necessity of its own nature, or through it is caused to exist through an external cause. Well, the latter doesn't apply to God, but the former does. So we are applying the PSR to God. We have overcome and defeated the taxi cab problem fallacy totally easily. It's not an issue for our version of the cosmological argument at all. Now, one thing so there are some potential problems that skeptics might raise, and I kind of just raised this one. Skeptics kind of pouting that they lost when they said, well, the universe exists necessarily out of an internal nature out of the internal necessity of its own nature, and we've just destroyed them by showing that the universe is contingent. Therefore, it requires an external cause, given the principle of sufficient reason. So, they might be a little bit upset about that. So now, trying to block the theists, they might just change their tune and say, fine, well, nothing can exist necessarily. I don't believe in necessary explanations. It's impossible for something to exist out of the internal necessity of its own nature. We don't understand how the explanations for necessary things exist, and therefore God, if you're positing a necessary thing, they don't work. So this is the skeptic just being an ignorant hypocrite, basically. There's no reason to suppose that God can't exist in a logically, or at the very least metaphysically necessary being. In that sense, there's no difference between him and numbers or propositions and that sort of thing. That virtually everyone with a PhD on the planet agrees that these things, if they exist in a concrete fashion, exist necessarily out of their own internal nature. And there's nothing about God compared to them that would make a difference there. So yeah, of course, it's plausible and coherent to say God is a logically or metaphysically necessary being. But what about the issues that I kind of mentioned about necessity? We don't know how necessity exactly works explanatorily as well as we do with contingent things. So I take that Alexander Proust, and I've provided his source on his Leibnizian cosmological argument. In section 2.1, he goes over the scope of the PSR, and we kind of covered this in part 4 a little bit, but just to go over this, there is no issue with necessity, right? So just because we have less experience with it, that doesn't mean that we don't know that it works. We know in a properly basic way that certain things are necessary. So therefore, it's not a problem positing explanations of a necessary sort. And again, it doesn't matter if you're an anti-realist and you don't believe that things like numbers or that sort of thing actually exist, and therefore there are no actually necessary things when we talk about numbers or mathematical propositions or truths and stuff like that. It doesn't matter. It's still coherent. If they were real, then they would exist necessarily. They're self-evident, logically necessarily true. And that's just obvious in a properly basic way. You're irrational as an atheist or a skeptic if you dare deny that truth, that obvious truth. But furthermore, this objection doesn't really apply, it doesn't typically apply to necessary things, like a being, like God. That there's no issue there. This objection really applies more to necessary truths or facts, propositions that happen to be true. That's what this objection about trying to reject the existence of necessary things altogether, necessary truths, that's what this argument is about, not necessary things, like a god or a being or something like that. But even there, it's just not a problem. I agree totally with Proust. Look, a necessary truth like P, for example, can be easily explained just by citing its necessity. P holds because P necessarily holds as true. Now, this may lead into a regress, since P necessarily holds will also be a necessary truth known as axiom S4 of modal logic. So you can just say, well, this regress is somehow to be distinguished from vicious ones. It's not necessarily a vicious infinite regress, even if there is this regress of, a necessary truth is founded upon the truth of axiom S4, which is a necessary truth. That in turn is grounded in axiom S4, again a necessary modal truth, and so on and so forth, potentially into infinity and that sort of thing. That isn't necessarily a vicious regress. But regardless of what you think of that explanation, and like I said, in the paper by Alexander Proust, he goes into this in section 2.1 on his paper, so click on that web link for his Leibnizian cosmological argument for more on this. But it's totally beside the point. This objection is talking about necessary truths. It doesn't necessarily apply to necessary things. We don't have the same problem with necessary things, right? We don't have this regress issue where one necessary truth is founded upon another necessary truth, founded upon another necessary truth. No, we just have a necessary thing that exists, period. So that this issue just isn't an issue for our argument at all. But I just wanted to raise it as a potential objection a skeptic might raise, and then you can let them know, number one, this objection doesn't apply to necessary things, it applies to necessary truths. And even if we did, like Alexander Proust, the reason he has to deal with this is his principle of sufficient reason is slightly stronger than ours. He doesn't just try to say that things that exist require an explanation. He's trying to say all facts, all truths, or true propositions, they require an explanation for their existence. So he's going a bit stronger, and that's why he has to get into this objection in his work, whereas it doesn't apply to our particular argument necessarily. But even if you wanted to go with Proust's argument and his stronger version of the PSR and go with his cosmological argument, there's no problem here. Who cares? Maybe there is this infinite regress, but it's not a vicious one. There's no problem. It's potentially infinite in the past through axiom S4 modal logic. So I hope that's clear. I didn't want to confuse you. For our purposes, you don't have to worry about this objection. Just understand they're confusing necessary things which do not entail an infinite regress versus the explanation for necessary truths. Those are totally different things, and depending on which version of the Leibnizian cosmological argument you're using, this objection may not apply at all. And in our case, it doesn't apply to my argument at all. And one last second objection here. So great, let's pretend that necessary things can in fact exist. And if you posit numbers are things that exist, you're a realist. Great, those things are necessary. David Hume kind of came up with an old principle that's totally foolish and wrong in my opinion, but he basically says, look, it's just impossible. The very notion of something existing, a thing existing, necessarily implies that it's possible for that thing not to exist. And he just asserts this, assert and assume, the typical skeptical strategy, the type that we see from the S&S type skeptics who don't really critically think. They just assert things. And this is what David Hume's doing here. There's no proof for this. I mean, it's just ridiculous. There's no reason to think that, well, just because something exists, that necessarily proves that it must be possible for it not to exist. No, the definition of being a logically necessary thing, it's logically necessitated that you exist, given the laws of logic. Impossible logically, or metaphysically in this case. It's more talking about metaphysical necessity in this argument as a broad logical necessity kind of thing for God to exist. So there's no reason to accept this principle that David Hume gives, where he just asserts, well, in order for something to exist, it must be possible for it not to exist. There's no warrant or reason to accept that principle, and we can just reject it as total garbage. No, there's no reason a thing, why it might not be impossible for a thing to not exist, such as God. Makes perfect sense. So it's just, he's basically just saying only abstract analytic truths, those are the only things that can exist necessarily, but again, no reason to accept this. And given the principle of indifference, philosophical principle of indifference, the atheist has to prove this. We have no reason to suppose otherwise as to why a concrete entity like a deity existing necessarily is any more or less plausible than an abstract number existing necessarily. Or technically, it's not numbers aren't abstract. I'm a divine conceptualist, so they're mental entities. But for the sake of argument here, an abstract number or can exist necessarily. So yeah, the atheist is just engaging in biased special pleading tactics on this front and trying to say, well, somehow God is different than a number or something else existing necessarily. No, there's no reason to differentiate on that front. So yeah, I think this argument is an utter failure. So great, that covers the taxi cab fallacy. So let's move on to the second problem then. What about overcoming the infinite regress problem? And as well, I'm going to cover the self-causation problem as part of this. Could the universe be self-caused, or could it be, great, the universe has to be caused by something, an external cause? Well, maybe there's an infinite regress of external causes, an actually infinite regress of external causes, and that's the explanation of our contingent existing universe. How do we respond to that? Okay, so before we get into the infinite regress problem, there's actually an additional problem here that needs to be addressed, and that is the fact of the self-causation problem. So if you remember from part 4 video where we covered the principle of sufficient reason, we said, look, everything that exists has an sufficient explanation or reason for its existence, and then we gave two options, either in its own internal necessity, or the necessity of its own internal nature, or, by contrast, an external cause. Now, what if there's a third option, though? What if a skeptic or an atheist says, well, what about the concept of self-causation? So it's not, we know that the universe is contingent and not necessary. It doesn't exist necessarily out of its own internal nature, but maybe it's not externally caused by some cause separate than itself. Instead, in a way, it's internally caused or externally caused by itself. It self-causes itself to exist. This is something that some atheists and skeptics have brought up as a possible option. And before we get into the infinite regress problem, I want to address this self-causation problem, as it's called, and this possible retort of a skeptic. So yeah, as we can see here, in terms of self-causation, this is logically absurd and it's total nonsense, and it's why the vast majority of everyone who knows what they're talking about, whether a layperson or a person with a PhD, nobody really truly believes this in terms of the concept of self-causation, even at the universal level, in terms of the universe causing itself. This just sounds like the ultimate picking yourself up by your cosmic bootstraps and stuff like that. You've heard these typical kind of objections from Christian apologists like Dr. William Lane Craig and that, and I think they're absolutely right. I mean, it's logically contradictory, right? When we say something is self-caused, we're saying, well, it exists as a cause, but it also doesn't exist until it causes itself to exist as its effect, as its own effect. So in this sense, we're saying, well, it both exists and it doesn't exist at the same time and in the same sense. And this is logically contradictory. So violating the logical law of non-contradiction, it's total rubbish. But that said, there is a potential quote-unquote loophole that some skeptics might give, and we kind of addressed this above in our part 3a show when we covered things like a closed time-like curve. Because given the B theory of time, maybe it's possible that there's a temporal causal loop, or just a causal loop of some sort. So there's a circularity of causes. You know, state A causes state B causes state C, and then it loops around. State C then causes state A, to exist. And in this case, it's self-caused, right? The same thing in different states. So state C externally causes state A to come into effect. State A in turn causes state B, and around and around it goes. So this actually isn't logically contradictory, and it's why we said that closed time-like curves, given the B theory of time, are coherent. They're plausible. They make sense. They could be true. So we have to address this. This form of self-causation does appear plausible. It's not self-contradictory or logically contradictory. So how do we respond to that? Well, in the first place, I think that this option is unlikely to be true, but someone might object to it based on a principle of the impossibility of circular causation. There are various theories on this front as to why circular causation is inherently incoherent. It couldn't be true. Now, as I said, I don't buy this myself. I don't think that these work. I think that causal loops could be true, or explanatory loops. There could be circular causation and or circular explanations. And certainly I do that as a Christian. So if you'll remember on our shows on epistemology, for example, I engage in circular reasoning, not necessarily causation, but my epistemology is logically circular because I believe in warrant. So my faculties are reliable in producing knowledge and a properly basic belief in a given thing, or just a belief in a given thing. Therefore, I obtain warrant. Well, how do I know that I'm warranted internally, though? Because this is an externalist criteria. Well, I have knowledge by acquaintance. It produces, whenever I'm warranted, my faculties provide me a warranted belief in a certain respect. This produces within me an internal irresistible inclination that I am cognizant of. And through knowledge by acquaintance, I am acquainted with what it means to be warranted. So my faculties cause me to have this knowledge by acquaintance. I know that I'm warranted. I'm acquainted with what it's like to be warranted, or to have knowledge, a warranted true belief. But by the same token, it's my faculties that provide the warrant for me, or the knowledge that I am acquainted with what it means to be warranted. So it's circular in that way, in terms of how my knowledge claims work. But that's not the same as saying it's viciously circular. The circular reasoning could be true, and or circular causation could be true, as we saw with those closed time-like curves on the B theory of time. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's viciously circular or begging the question or something like that. So we have to distinguish between circular causation or a viciously circular causal loop. The two aren't necessarily the same type of thing. But here's the point here. Who cares? Let's pretend that there can be causal loops in this way. Pretend that this is plausible and we could have this. It's totally irrelevant to our argument, because let's pretend that there is it. There's still the need for an explanation of the causal loop as a whole. And that can't be explained by any of the contingent things within that loop. So it requires an external cause to explain the loop itself. So we can always ask, well, why this causal loop as opposed to another causal loop that's we can logically conceivable, or why isn't there no causal loop at all? Certainly we can, it's conceivable that there would be no causal loop, which includes the existence of our contingent universe at all, right? So yeah, ultimately there's always going to be this need for this ultimate explanation through an external cause, a cause that is external to the loop itself, that explains why that causal loop exists. And okay, well, what about, couldn't we appeal, maybe the causal loop is internally necessary, right? And then we would have to say, well, no, it's not, because again, we can conceive, modally speaking, we can conceive that this specific causal loop that we're envisioning didn't exist, or there's a different causal loop that exists. So we know that the causal loop itself is contingent. It's not logically necessary or metaphysically necessary in any sense of the word. So Yeah, that's the answer to the self-causation thing. We're going to get a bit into more detail as to why um, explanations or causes of the individual elements of an entire set, either in a causal loop or, as we'll see in the next little bit, within a series of infinite regress of causes and effects, is insufficient to explain the whole set, the set as a whole. Um, so yeah, it doesn't work in terms of causal loops. Great. So yeah, we've refuted the self-causation avenue. It doesn't work. And even if it does, a causal loop of some sort is deemed to be plausible, not necessarily a closed time-like curve thing. There were physical problems, but maybe there's a supernatural causal loop or some kind of metaphysical causal loop or something like that. Let's just grant that it's totally irrelevant. We still have to ask why that loop as opposed to a different one, and or why that loop as opposed to no loop, causal loop at all. Why is there this causal loop that includes the existence of our contingent universe in it? And that question can't be answered by appealing to the series of causes in the loop itself. It requires an external cause, and given that it's not logically necessary, it therefore requires a cause that is external to the loop, a loop external cause. Great. Okay, so what about, let's move on to the infinite regress problem then. Okay, so the atheist or skeptic might say, great, look, we know that the universe exists contingently from the truth of premise one, so it doesn't exist out of the necessity of its own internal nature. That's not the explanation. Furthermore, we saw that it can't be explained through self-causation, so it does require an external cause. Great. So how do we explain that then? Well, given that the universe is eternal, if we assume that, then maybe it's possible for there to be an infinite regress of external causes, one after the other, that each provides sufficient explanations for the next domino in the chain, eventually leading to the existence of our universe as we see it. Now, various atheists have tried this. So David Hume is famous for this. People like Paul Edwards, Joseph Campbell, they've all tried to adopt this line of reasoning as a way to avoid the theistic implications of our Leibnizian cosmological argument, or our argument from the contingency of the universe here. And basically, it's supposed by them that by providing a cause for each of the individual things in the collection, or the components, like our universe, whatever came before that, whatever before that, and before that, and whatever, by providing a sufficient external cause for each individual thing in that infinite set or collection, well, then that constitutes a sufficient reason or explanation for the whole collection itself. So basically, the whole is adequately explained by explaining the cause of each of its parts. This is what their notion is. And unfortunately, most philosophers have recognized the utter fallaciousness of this kind of reasoning, as we saw above with the causal loops requiring a loop external cause. It's the same thing here. We need an infinite set external cause to explain the set as a whole. This is because, there are obvious cases where more explanation is required for the whole collection or set. So, for example, just as we said with the causal loop, we have an infinite regress of causes and effects in a infinite set. Well, why that infinite set and not a different infinite set? Why is it that infinite regress of things exists as opposed to another infinite regress or set of things? Or why this infinite set or compared to no infinite set? And for this, the sufficient explanation must inherently be contrastive in nature in order to qualify as sufficient, because we're saying why this and not that, or why this and not anything at all. And in order to do that, you need to appeal to an external explanation or an external cause to explain why this particular infinite set itself exists. Nothing within the infinite set, or no explanation or causes of the individual things within that set, whether infinite or not, are able to answer or to sufficiently explain or give a reason for the existence of the set itself. So philosopher Dr. Richard M. Gale, for example, and I provide a source in my blog. It's in the footnote kind of thing, so you can get the link to that when you come upon this when I'm addressing the infinite regress problem. But yeah, Richard Gale, he used the counterexample of explaining, give me the sufficient explanation or reason why 100 Inuit people were standing on a given street corner in New York on a particular afternoon. Well, according to these atheists and skeptics, they might try to say, well, we're just going to provide explanations for each individual person's presence. And that should be sufficient, right, to explain why the whole is there. 100 Inuits are standing on the street corner in New York on that particular afternoon. But obviously that's inadequate. Those individual explanations don't, like, well, he got on a subway. He chose to leave his house. He chose to get on a subway. Another Inuit. Well, he chose to leave his house. He chose to get into a car. He chose to drive down this street, blah, blah, blah. That's not a sufficient reason to explain the coincidence of why 100 Inuit people are all at the same place at the same time. So it requires an external explanation here to explain that coincidence of that state of affairs. And that's an independent explanation in its own right. It's external to the set of individual explanations. So, we might say, why is it 100 Inuit people are all on that same corner, all on the same day and time? Well, maybe we'll appeal to an external fact, like there was an organized protest taking place, and each of these members wanted to join that protest. And this explains that coincidence. So that's what we have there in terms of the coincidence of occurrence. Now, that said, the atheist may still have a trick or two up his sleeve. So Joseph Campbell, I mentioned him above, he recognizes the validity of this Inuit example and this argument by Gale. And he says, yes, this is absolutely true. But then he kind of modifies the infinite regress, and he just says, well, look, maybe the principle here, is to deny the classical Humean claim of an infinite regress that essentially goes like this. Look, it says, quote unquote, in explaining every conjunct of things, or giving an individual explanation for every individual thing within a collection or set, one has thereby sufficiently explained the whole collection or set. That's the classical Humean infinite regress principle. And Richard M. Gale has totally destroyed that. You're an utter fool if you believe that. And this atheist here, Joseph Campbell, saying, you're absolutely right. You've destroyed atheists and skeptics. But I've got a little trick up my sleeve, because I'm going to water things down. Instead of advancing the Humean principle, I've got my own. How about this? Quote unquote, for any collection or set that one has explained every conjunct or every individual part, given an individual explanation for every individual thing in that set, one might, not necessarily that they do have, but that they might have thereby explained the whole set. So there's that option. It allows for there to be counterexamples, like with the Gale's Inuit example. But by the same token, perhaps there are some sets where this does work. And obviously the implication is, well, the universe is one such set where we do explain the whole by explaining each individual cause. So here's an example that is given here to support this. So suppose that there are only 2 Inuit people standing on the same street corner in New York one afternoon. Clearly, that kind of coincidence doesn't seem to require an explanation in its own right to explain the coincidence that's external to the set itself. Now, unless one considers random chance a sufficient explanation that is external to the set, and by the way, I do, so I would deny Campbell's claim here. I think that there is an external cause, and that is the mechanism of random chance. That's a sufficient explanation. As we saw before when we did in part 4, we studied quantum phenomena and in terms of the principle of sufficient reason, and chance does provide a sufficient reason for the existence of quantum phenomena, and it also provides a sufficient reason or explanation for the coincidence of two Inuit people standing on the same street corner at the same time. But what's more here, even in the case of the 100 Inuit people on the corner that Gale gave, even then, all we're really rationally justified in saying is that it seems likely that there is a further explanation beyond individual ones for that kind of coincidental fact or occurrence. It's not necessarily that there is such an explanation. Again, this is borrowing random chance as a sufficient explanation, which I don't do, but Joseph Campbell does. So this is his argument. How do we come back on this? Well, look, I would just say, even with this modified or weakened version of the causal efficacy for each of the parts in terms of sufficiently explaining the whole set itself, this has been shown to be insufficient for defeating the impossibility of an infinite regress of individual causal explanations. Why? Well, Richard Swinburne, the famous Christian philosopher from Oxford University, he conclusively refutes this notion. Basically, what he does is he argues that regardless of whether a given collection or set of things to be explained is infinite or finite, it doesn't matter. Irrespective of whether the set is infinite or finite, there's an underlying causal principle for any such series or collection. And here's quote unquote, to quote his words, as to what this principle is, quote unquote, any full cause of the occurrence of any collection of things or state of affairs and events is any collection of full causes of each, which are not members of the former collection. So what does that mean? So basically, the principle is the case. The principle is true here because it's logically absurd for something to be self-explanatory or cause. So here's what Richard Swinburne does. He gives this sort of example to illustrate. He says, look, imagine there's a finite collection of causes and effects that constitute what he calls a full cause. So he has different types, partial versus full causes. So there's a full cause of A, and that's B. Now the full cause of B is C, and the full cause of C is D. And then he takes it further and he says, well, let's posit E. The full cause of E is F. And for F, its full cause is G. So then Swinburne argues, look, given the self-evident causal principle, which rules out the logical absurdity of self-causation and that sort of thing, we kind of addressed that above, well then we can then ask, what is the full cause of the collection or series A, B, C, E, and F plus F as a whole? And obviously we would look to external causal factors not included in that collection or series to be explained. In this case, what is that? Well, it's D and G. Those are what provide the sufficient explanation for that set, ABC plus EF. So in this way, Swinburne really kind of concludes, look, we can say that with finite collections of a series of things or events which stand in causal relations to each other, it must have its cause outside of that collections or things. So that's how he establishes that this is the case for a finite collection. But quite obviously, this logic also applies in the case of a finite universe as a collection of individual physical things or a state of affairs throughout its history as well. So whether the finite set is a bunch of letters or it's the collection of things in the universe, all of its various states of affairs and physical and non-physical things, because there's souls in the universe, but everything, particles, planets, whatever. The same principle applies here. You need this external cause. And even if the universe is an infinite or eternal collection of these things, the principle still applies. You need to appeal to these external causes, to D and G, to explain the set of A, B, C, E, F plus infinity in the case of an infinite set, right? The entire infinite collection of things or events or whatever it is, why does that exist rather than nothing or rather than another infinite set of causal chains? When you ask that question, it requires a contrastive explanation in order to be sufficient. In order to provide a contrastive explanation, you have to inherently and by definition appeal to a cause that is external from the members of that quote-unquote universe causal set, or universal causal set as Swinburne calls it. So again, just to reinforce this, the question at stake here is a contrastive one, and that's why a sufficient explanation must entail that it be a contrastive explanation which appeals to an external cause outside the members of the set itself. Already said that, just wanted to re-emphasize that again. So, obviously, as I said, the universe itself is defined as the entire collection, space and time, and all physical and non-physical things contained therein, as well as all the events throughout the history of space and time. So this would require an external cause beyond the confines of physicality and beyond the confines of space and time as we know it. Okay, so that covers that. Just before we move on to the third problem, the infamous gap problem, I think it'll be appropriate here to just briefly touch upon the multiverse explanation. When we're talking about an infinite regress of external causes, well, perhaps there's infinite multiverse theories and that sort of thing. So I just want to take a moment to briefly address that. We'll address the remainder of the multiverse option in the gap problem, the third problem, and third and final problem, that infamous gap problem for the cosmological argument. But just for right here and now in this part, it's important to look at the multiverse as a potential infinite explanation of the universe's existence, and that may include an infinite regress of sequential and or simultaneously existing causes and explanations. So in appealing to multiverse theory, it's important to recognize that there are various types and versions of multiverses that one could appeal to here. But essentially they all fit into three main categories of multiverse. So the first main category are what are called physically consistent models. And we looked at these in part 3b of my cosmological argument. We looked at these things, right? We looked at various eternal inflationary models of the universe. There's eternal string theory based models of the universe where there's multiple universes in sequential order. Sir Roger Penrose, he gives a notion of a sequential cyclical type model of the universe and that sort of thing, or loop quantum gravity. So these would all fit under physically consistent multiverse models, and we kind of refuted that above in part 3a. They're all improbable and that sort of thing, but that's the first main category that most atheists and skeptics think of when they're thinking about a multiverse, and lay Christians for that matter as well. But there are two other categories here. So, ones that aren't constrained by the laws of physics. So, for example, there are metaphysical multiverse models. So people who advocate for these are people like David Lewis, or Max Tegmark. He has a certain metaphysical multiverse model, for example, whereby there are no constraints, contingent or otherwise, on the actualization of the universe except for the laws of logic. And then finally, there are supernatural multiverse models. So people like John Leslie, or my very own prof from Ryerson University who was on our show, Dr. Class J. Cray, or Class Cray. He's a proponent of, or at least was a proponent of, the supernatural multiverse model. And I would say with the supernatural models, the implication here is that they are beyond the laws of logic. Nothing, even supernatural things, cannot violate the laws of logic. Those are logically and supernaturally necessary. They cannot be violated. They're necessarily true. So supernatural models are actually more limited than the metaphysical multiverse models, even if it doesn't seem that way according to some of the experts who argue for supernatural models and think that, well, supernatural entails you can violate the laws of logic. No, that's not true. So I would reverse it and say that supernatural models are more restricted compared to metaphysical multiverse models, whereby only the laws of logic are what provide the constraints as to what is a universe that could exist versus not, or is impossible to exist, and that sort of thing. So yeah, all of the metaphysical and supernatural models are supposedly actually infinite in nature, whereas only some of the physically consistent multiverse models are postulated to be actually infinite versus finite. Like there are multiverse models that are finite; they're not eternal in the past. So yeah, just wanted to clarify that. And yeah, I think when it comes to these multiverse models, the thing to point out at least here at this point, is that none of them are logically nor metaphysically necessary. With the physically consistent models, we saw that we can imagine the laws of nature being different, or there being no laws of nature. Therefore, there are possible worlds where there is no physically consistent multiverse or something like that, and therefore it um, can't be logically or metaphysically necessary. Same deal with metaphysical or supernatural multiverses, right? These aren't logically nor metaphysically necessary either. There's no logical contradiction. There's no hidden or metaphysical contradiction in terms of um, broad logicality as opposed to strict logicality. Um, contradiction entailed in positing a possible world where these multiverses are different, or in some way, or that they don't exist at all. So, unfortunately, yeah, as we're going to see, appealing to the multiverse in any of the three varieties or types, it doesn't get you off the hook. Nothing is internally necessary, or necessary given its own internal logical or metaphysical nature or anything like that. um, to the point where we can say, yeah, well, therefore the multiverse is this foundational ultimate explanation for the existence of the universe, which is a part of a part of an infinite multiverse or something like that. So yeah, that's my take on the multiverse for now. Obviously, once we get into the next part, the gap problem, we're going to provide additional reasons that will rule out a multiverse explanation or some kind of natural explanation or something like that, and get us more towards the traditional theistic explanation, i.e., God, or the God one hypothesis. But that's it for now under this one. Now, additionally, just before I move on, don't forget from premise one, we have additional reasons to reject an infinite regress type explanation, because we can prove that it's logically impossible and contradictory for an actual infinite to exist, including an infinite regress of external causes causing the universe, cause and effect, and eventually leading up to the cause of our universe, or universe plus. And when I say universe plus, so finally I can explain why I used that word in premise one there. So the universe plus, it can include a supernatural and or metaphysical multiverse, in addition to a physical multiverse, or cosmos or something like that. So I just use the word universe plus just to kind of enforce the point that, look, when we're saying the universe, it's all of space and time and its contents. Universe plus could be expanded to include everything that exists, including a supernatural multiverse or metaphysical multiverse as well. So that's what I mean by the term universe plus there. I'm kind of expanding the definition of universe in our original argument to encompass those things as well, beyond just, space and time and its contents, physical contents as well as non-physical contents like our souls and stuff like that. But yeah, the point is here, we can reapply those arguments from premise one for the impossibility of an actual infinite. Well, if actual infinites are logically impossible, well, that means that argument applies here. From part one, it applies here in part five. That rules out an infinite regresses of external causes. That's impossible because actual infinites are impossible. So that argument applies, and that was proven beyond reasonable doubt, 95.01% proven. that actual infinites are logically impossible when applied to explaining our universe and that sort of thing, especially, but in particular as well. Now, there were other arguments. I don't think they can apply at this point. So there's that second philosophical argument that assumed the A theory of time and said it's impossible to form an actual infinite through successive addition. Well, at this point, in this section of the argument, I'm not assuming an A theory of time versus a B theory of time or anything like that. But yeah, if you wanted to use that argument that the A theory of time is true, well, okay, great, that's for the universe. But what about a metaphysical multiverse or a supernatural multiverse? Could there be a B theory of time or a tenseless theory of time going on for that? So I don't think we can use this argument to rule out an infinite regress of causes and effects in the same way we can with the first philosophical argument. And obviously my abductive argument based on the scientific evidence, well, that just applies to our physical universe and or the physically consistent multiverse explanations. But that argument can't, by definition, apply to and rule out metaphysical multiverses or supernatural multiverses. And of course, those could be infinite. There's nothing in my abductive scientific argument based on cosmology that could rule out an infinite regress of causes on that basis. So it's really from our premise one in our part one video, it's really only that first deductive philosophical argument about the impossibility of an actual infinite in general, based on the thought experiments that apply to the universe and or its causes in general, that we can use here to rule out the possibility of an infinite regress. So yeah, I think all things considered, that's it. In terms of self-causation and the infinite regress problem, we've shown that it's inevitable. You always ultimately have to arrive at some kind of foundational, external, universe and or universe plus external cause that exists out of either logical and or metaphysical necessity of its own internal nature. That has to be the explanation, the sufficient explanation of the universe. Whatever that might entail, it's got to be logically or at the very least metaphysically necessary based on its own internal nature. So yeah, whatever that external cause is, it's necessary and it forms the foundation. It's the beginning cause, so to speak. It's the prime mover kind of thing. It's the thing that starts off and creates either directly the universe or universe plus directly, or it sets off the causal chain. It creates something, it causes something, that causes something, and that causes our universe, or whatever you want to. We haven't gotten to stipulating that yet, but we do know at this point self-causation doesn't work. There can't be an infinite regress of external causes and effect. So there has to be this foundation, this beginning cause that's external to the universe, and or a series, infinite series of causes and effects, and or self-causation, whatever. It's external to the universe, and it ultimately serves as the foundational cause, and that it itself is explained in its existence through the logical and or metaphysical necessity of its own internal nature. So that's what we've proven so far. Oh, great. That's awesome. And in terms of the subjective probabilities, I included that in my paper. So I basically assign my subjective probabilities to the various factors that are relevant to overcoming the self-causation and infinite regress problems. And I arrived at 99.95% proven that the infinite regress problem has been overcome, and that including the self-causation problem, it equals 98.94% proven that we've overcome both the self-causation and the infinite regress problem, and have therefore established that the universe requires a logically and or metaphysically necessary cause that is external to the universe itself. Boom. That's what we've established here in overcoming problem 3. So yeah, that's where we are at the moment. let's move on to the last and final problem, the most important: overcoming that gap problem. Great, I can grant you everything so far. How do we get God from that? And that's the ultimate question. So let's get into that next. Well, in the first place, in one sense, we could say that our job is already done because if you remember back at the beginning, premise 3 just says that the sufficient explanation for the universe, the logically and metaphysically necessary external cause of the universe, is the God one hypothesis, not necessarily God the being proper, or even our God final hypothesis, because we're building up a cumulative case argument here. So in one sense I could say, hey, look, we've got this attribute that it's eternal and logically or metaphysically necessary, and it's an external cause to the universe. That's enough. That's the God one hypothesis, and I could call it quits here, and I've supposedly done my job, right? That's the God one hypothesis, and we can move on to the next argument. Now, obviously, that's going to be unsatisfactory for both atheists and for Christian theists or theists in general. We want a little bit more. So on that front, okay, great. Well, guess what? It's not just that the external cause is metaphysically and or logically necessary and eternal and foundational nature, but we also there's also directly implied in the success of the cosmological argument, as we've laid it out up to this point, there are several other attributes that are directly implicit in what we found out here. Because remember, what is the universe or the universe plus? Well, it's all of space and time, all dimensions of time, all spatial dimensions, and its contents. That includes both all of physical reality, as well as our non-physical souls and that sort of thing, if you believe we have souls, and that. So on this basis, it actually implies several other attributes of the God one hypothesis that gets us a little bit closer to God. So for example, as I said, it's logically and metaphysically necessary, and from that it's also eternal in nature and foundational. But additionally, remember, the universe is defined as being constituting all of the physical or material contents as well. So therefore, in order to be external to that, the cause has to be non-physical or immaterial. That's another direct property implicit from the success of the cosmological argument alone. Secondly, it's got to be spaceless, because it's all of space. That defines the universe. And if you're external to all of space and all spatial dimensions, well, then you must be spaceless. Secondly, it's external to all of time. That includes hypertime dimensions and everything. There has to be an external cause of all time, whether that's hypertime or our own temporal dimensions. So therefore, the external cause has to be timeless, given our definition of universe and or a universe plus. Based on its timelessness, well, it follows then that it's implied it's beginningless, it's changeless. And that doesn't mean it can't change. It's not unchangeable, it's just changeless, at least without the creation of the universe. Once the universe is created, well, then it can change. Then we'll be arguing in terms of God's relationship. He enters into time and he then changes. But that's outside of the cosmological argument. It's outside what we're talking about now. But I will do an appendix show on God's relationship to time. I promised Chris State that I would do that about a year and a half ago. So I will finally get that done. But yeah, so without creation, not before, but without creation, it is changeless, not unchangeable. And then finally, it's enormously powerful. The universe contains various powers and causal powers and that sort of thing. It's immensely powerful. So that would take something enormously powerful to cause all of the powers that the universe is able to actualize and create for those. And part of this, I think it's called the iterativeness postulate. We'll get into this when we get into another argument addressing the gap problem. But look, if something has the power to gain the power to do something else, that's the same as though it has the power. It just has to take 2 steps. So I just wanted to clarify that. So obviously, yeah, anything that the universe created after the fact. Like, it had the causal ability, and it caused, through its causal powers, something to come about that God didn't directly cause himself. He indirectly created it through the universe, and then the universe's causal powers actualized some state of, or had the power that was exercised to create something else. Maybe, if you believe in evolution, maybe like human beings, or whatever it is. If you believe in an evolutionary history of the universe and you don't believe God created every single thing directly himself, nonetheless, God is still the ultimate cause of that, because he's the one he had the power to enact something with the power and cause something that had the power to create that other thing. So that's a philosophical modal principle that we'll be getting into in a little bit more detail below. But bottom line is, look, it's enormous. Whatever this cause is, it's enormously powerful. I'm talking about God. We're not there yet, right? We're still at the God one hypothesis, and we've got these features or minimal attributes that are directly implied by the truth of our cosmological argument as we've discussed so far. So that's great. That's incredible. That's definitely sounding a lot like God. But we're not there yet. There's still ways to go. We still need to plug that gap, because that's obviously not the full concept of God. It doesn't cover omnipotence, omniscience, his moral perfection, all omnipresence, all these features. Well, the cosmological argument on its own can't give us that, and that's where the need for supplemental argumentation comes in, and we need to attach supplemental arguments based on the attributes that are implicit in the cosmological argument itself, and we can take that, the nature of the universe and the implied properties of the first cause or ultimate explanation, and then extrapolate that through either deductive, or otherwise known as metaphysical argumentation, or through inductive arguments. Things like appealing to the best explanation, and that for the design of the universe or something. So that's where the teleological argument might come in, and in a cumulative case could be used here, in that respect, to argue inductively for other attributes or additional attributes of this first cause or ultimate explanation that we've been taught, that we've proven so far, must exist in order to externally cause the universe or universe plus to exist. Okay, so how can we fill this gap? How do we get to God? Well, in the first place, we have to say that the one way we could fill this gap and gain everything at once is through a properly basic belief. So it may be that the cosmological argument, as we've proven the 6 to 7 attributes we've established so far, that alone is enough to spark within you and induce within you a properly basic belief that goes, and that explanation is God. You get the rest in a properly basic way. Based on the foundation of your derivative knowledge of what we've derived objectively through the cosmological argument and this cause's attributes so far. So that may be a way to get all of God, or at least part of God, additional attributes here that weren't covered directly, proven objectively through our argument. Now, I personally do not have a properly basic belief resting upon the foundation of what we've done so far, so I can't personally use this method to plug the gap problem, but some of you guys out there might be able to. Maybe you do this alone, logically and or metaphysically necessary and eternal, non-physical or immaterial, spaceless, timeless, changeless, beginningless, an enormously powerful cause, and then based on that, boom, and that I've got a properly basic belief that is God and all of his attributes, omnipotent, omniscient, blah, blah, blah. Maybe you have that, and that's perfectly valid. Just because I don't doesn't take away from the fact that you have that, you are privy to that subjective evidence. Nonetheless, for those like me that don't have a properly basic belief based on, that derived bit of knowledge known, those attributes alone, well, don't worry, because we have other objective arguments that can derive yet further attributes or properties of this ultimate explanation or this external cause of the universe, and it gets us closer to God. So the first and most important, most of the work on addressing the gap problem is directed towards addressing this issue, and it's really the one that I care most about, although it's tied with another feature that we'll get into. The moral goodness, I think, is really important as well. But the first attribute is the personhood or the agency of the ultimate explanation of the universe. So how can we get to that based on the entailed attributes that we've established so far? Okay, so I mentioned that one way we could get that is through a properly basic belief. I don't have that, but maybe you do. Great, so that's one method that fails for me personally, so we require something else. Well, I kind of hinted at, well, in a cumulative case argument, it could be that other arguments for the existence of God that we're going to cover later in our series can speak to the personhood or agency of this ultimate explanation of the universe. For example, the teleological argument. We can use that as part of an inductive argument that says, well, the universe is intelligently designed, or based on the fine-tuning of the universe. That proves that there's an intelligent designer. An intelligent designer must be an agent or person, because design includes choice and that sort of thing, free will choice. So if the teleological argument is successful, an intelligent designer is a person and an agent. This would establish this attribute. Whoever caused the universe to exist also caused it to be fine-tuned. That must mean they're an intelligent designer, i.e. a person or an agent. So we could establish it that way. Obviously, we haven't covered the teleological argument, so I'm not going to include that now. But later on in our series, after we do establish it, if I do include this argument and think it works, then you could go back to the cosmological argument and plug that in here. Additionally, it's not just teleological arguments. You could do the same with other arguments that prove that, the moral argument, for example, the ultimate explanation for all moral values and duties. That's got to be a person. Or the argument for the origin of beauty, or rather aesthetic values and aesthetic judgments. I made a brief argument proving that that's got to be a personal agent, God, or something like that. And okay, great. So if you if those are successful, you can plug those in here as part of a cumulative case argument. Bada boom, bada bing. You've proven that the ultimate explanation of the universe and universe's contingent existence must be a person and have agencies. These are two ways. Again, they're not going to factor into our assessment at this time, just because I haven't gone over it in my series. I haven't gone over these arguments at all and established it. But maybe you're ahead of me and you've already done the work. So if you're in that boat, then plug in your values here for these factors and prove that the cause of the universe must be a person, or must be personal, in case if it's tri-personal, like in the Christian God's case. Okay, so aside from these factors that won't be counting in our series here, there are about 3 to 4 other mainstream arguments that I'm going to do. There's much more than this, but these are the ones that I wanted to kind of focus on from my research. So the first way is the way that Richard Swinburne kind of establishes his arguments, and he looks at, in his book, look, there are 2 different types of explanation. There are scientific explanations, and then there are personal explanations. So scientific explanations work through event-to-event causation, blah, blah, blah. One thing causes another, determinism, not including quantum indeterminacy, which I'm not a believer in, but you get what I'm saying. Whereas the personal explanations appeal to personal motives and or agent causation. So that's Swinburne. But I think that Swinburne's dichotomy there is incomplete. There's also a third type of potential explanation. In this front, remember, we're looking at a PSR, so that's we're looking for the ultimate explanation, and that happens to be a first cause, because we've ruled out the necessity of the universe. But nonetheless, there is a third type of explanation, and that is conceptual explanations, things like propositions or numbers, things of that nature. Concepts can provide potentially an explanation for the universe. So we have these minimally 3 types of explanations that we need to assess. And looking at the second way, looking at the scientific explanations first, Richard Swinburne basically says, look, this is uh, just involves event causation, which takes place in time. We are immediately able to rule this option out because the laws of nature, physics, all physical things, fields, energy in the quantum vacuum, the constants, all of those initial conditions and fields or laws of nature, the explanation for that has to come external to that because the universe contains, our definition of universe contains all of that, and we need an external explanation, external from all of physics and nature in order to explain that. And plus we saw that these things are contingent anyways, so they're not logically necessary and or metaphysically necessary. They can't fit the bill. So scientific explanations totally fail. We can't appeal to a scientific explanation to explain the contingent existence of the universe. Okay, great. Well, what about conceptual explanations? The type of explanation that Swinburne doesn't address in his cosmological argument, in his book, The Existence of God. What do we make of that? This is whereby some kind of fact is explained through another conceptually connected fact, or i.e. a true proposition. And an issue arises here because any conceptual explanation of a contingent fact or proposition will itself merely involve a contingent proposition. And if that's the case, then it necessitates the existence of some non-conceptual explanation in order to provide, at least in part or fully, in order to explain the actualization of an existing thing, such as the universe, right? So conceptual entities like numbers or propositions, as you've heard William Lane Craig say it a million times, they don't stand in causal relations to other things. They're only concrete type explanations or things are able to exercise causal powers and cause something else to exist. Conceptual objects do not stand in causal relations with anything. So that's a main problem that William Lane Craig gives, and why we have to rule out conceptual explanations as a viable candidate, apart from a personal explanation and that sort of thing. Going back to Swinburne, this all rests because, look, the universe plus contains various existing physical substances, and substances are self-standing. So even the fundamental particles, which are physical substances in their own right, conceptual explanations are totally causally inefficacious. They have no causal connection to these other substances. Substances are self-standing. They stand under and bear up their property. So that rules out the conceptual explanations. And thus the only plausible remaining alternative is the personal explanation. God was a personal, libertarian free will agent, and he freely chose, for the motivation of our, selfless motivation of trying to create us and the universe for our benefit. He chose to create through agent causation. That's the only candidate that's plausible as an external cause for explaining the contingent existence of our universe and or universe plus. So that's, in a nutshell, that's how this first argument works and gets to the personhood or agency. It looks at the various three main alternatives for an explanation and rules them out. Now, with this line of argumentation, perhaps we're being a little bit premature, because some philosophers, remember we provided, there's only three types of explanations: scientific explanations, conceptual explanations, and personal or agent explanations. And we've ruled out scientific explanations, we've ruled out conceptual explanations. Therefore, the only thing left is a personal explanation. Some philosophers say, no, there's a fourth candidate. And I'm going to get to that in a moment, but I think it's proper for me to insert two remaining arguments. These by are the ones Dr. William Lane Craig is famous for, and it helps us to rule out scientific and or conceptual explanations and prove that only a personal explanation could exist. So before I get into the fourth alternative, I'm going to insert two additional arguments by Dr. William Lane Craig here that favors the personal cause or personal explanation through agent causation option. So in the first place, through a conceptual analysis, remember, we've got those properties: enormously powerful, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, non-physical, all of those things that we've got through the cosmological argument directly. And William Lane Craig looks at that and says, okay, great, so it can't be a scientific explanation or a physical explanation because the universe, number one, definitionally includes all physical things, so there's nothing that has the causal power that's physical that could cause all physical things. Otherwise, it would be part of the set, and our explanation has to be external to that. But in addition, William Lane Craig argues independently that, look, just the conceptual analysis of these features, what kinds of things could be spaceless, timeless, beginningless, changeless, blah, 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 and cause the universe, all of space and time and physical things to come into existence. Well, it can't be anything physical. That leaves, there's only two types of things: an unembodied mind and abstract objects like numbers, blah, blah, blah. Those conceptual explanations were ruled out in similar ways to Richard Swinburne would give. They don't stand in causal relations and that sort of thing. They can't cause anything. They're not intelligent, so how would they design? Even if they could cause, how would they design the universe in certain ways if you believe that there's proof for certain design features in the universe? Obviously, that depends on the success of other arguments and that sort of thing. So in this way, we can rule out these abstract objects, or what Proust calls these conceptual type explanations, and again, you're left just with a personal explanation. Only an unembodied mind that has libertarian free will conceptually is possible to explain the existence of physical things in the universe. Then we have this additional third argument for the personhood or agency that Dr. William Lane Craig gives, that I tried to give in the show with T-Jump, and I think it's the strongest one. I really like this one. But it's basically, look, when we ask, well, how is it even possible for a contingent effect like the existence of our universe or universe plus to derive from a necessary and sufficient cause? A cause that's logically and metaphysically necessary and has all of the necessary and sufficient conditions initially present for all of eternity without it leading to the effect existing necessarily itself, right? And by necessary, I mean in a necessary dependent way. Like numbers are necessary, but they're necessary dependent. They're mental thoughts within God's head, for example. They depend on God's existence for them to exist necessarily. The universe, as we saw, is contingent. It's not a necessary dependent thing, and it should be if it's not a personal explanation, right? Because if the necessary and sufficient conditions are present in whatever this necessary cause is for all of eternity, then the universe will exist for all of eternity over an actually infinite series of temporal or states of affairs and events and stuff like that, one before another. So if that's the case, that if there was this impersonal, mechanical set of necessary and sufficient conditions existing either timelessly or within some form of actually infinite hypertime dimension, for all of eternity in that hypertime dimension, then the effect of our contingent existing universe must be logically entailed and therefore exists necessarily in a necessary dependent way, just like numbers. But as we saw, and this, just for help, if you remember back in part 4, when we addressed the premise 2 of the principle of sufficient reason, we gave that argument by Peter Van Inwagen and Richard Swinburne for modal fatalism. Their argument trying to disprove the principle of sufficient reason is true exactly because of this problem. So the skeptics of my argument are actually helping me make my point and make Dr. William Lane Craig's point here, because if you saw that the inevitability of the success of their argument in defeating the PSR, if all of their premises were true, well then you recognize immediately the exact same principle here, that, well, necessary and sufficient conditions will, over the course of all of eternity, will logically entail that the effect must exist necessarily, can't be contingent, and would be here for all of eternity as well. So yeah, only the metaphysically necessary cause or explanation of the universe, only if that is a personal agent endowed with libertarian free will, is it even possible that the universe could exist contingently and only come into existence 13.82 billion years ago from a timeless and or eternal necessary cause that has necessary and sufficient conditions present for all of eternity. Only if someone has a dual ability, so they have the ability to either to create or to will to create, and to simultaneously refrain from willing to do something like create. So only a personal agent has the ability to, even though the necessary and sufficient God always for all of eternity, or this personal cause for all of eternity, had the necessary and sufficient causal powers to create the universe, but that wasn't necessitated because it had free will. It had the ability to refrain from exercising its causal powers through its own free will choice. That's basically what this argument was. This is what I was trying to explain with T-Jump. And I think this is a devastating case. It absolutely proves whatever the explanation is, it's got to be a personal agent endowed with libertarian free will who has a dual ability, because otherwise it's impossible for the universe to be contingent and non-eternal in nature. That's the thing right there. So okay, great. So those are the arguments that I wanted to raise. But okay, well, Dale, you've covered the three options. Scientific explanations, garbage. Conceptual or abstract explanations, garbage. Personal explanations, the only one that works. Great, grand, and groovy. You've proven it. But don't forget, some skeptics have come up with a fourth proposal for an explanatory option. And this is basically some kind of metaphysically necessary governing principle of some sort. And it has to be a governing principle of a special sort, right? So examples of governing principles, there could be the laws of logic, philosophical first principles. There's a logical law of non-contradiction, and that's what created the universe. Or, going slightly more religious, in Eastern religious traditions, there's kind of a metaphysical principle of karma or something. Maybe that created the universe and stuff like that. So they go with this option. But obviously appealing to philosophical first principles like the logical law of non-contradiction or karma or something like that, well, that's rubbish. That can't explain or cause anything of the universe to exist, right? That it has to be a metaphysical governing principle of a special sort, where it's the existence of this governing principle inherently entails that the universe would be caused to exist contingently and that sort of thing. So what on earth would be a proposal for this? And there's only one that some philosophers have mentioned, and this is what's called the principle of optimism, or otherwise known as the principle of optimization. This is a metaphysical governing principle, and maybe this is what created the universe. Now, this option has been advanced by philosophers such as John Leslie or Dr. Nicholas Rescher, for example. And one thing I just have to say right off the bat, the last argument we just covered about where we proved that it has to be positively a personal agent with libertarian free will would apply to this principle of optimism and rule it out, right? Because, well, if there's a metaphysically necessary governing principle of optimism or optimalization that inherently entails, it optimizes all the good things and brings all potential good things into actualization, to optimize the grand state of affairs. That's what the principle of optimization entails, and that's why it inherently can cause a universe or things to come into existence based on what it says. At least that's the alleged argument there, right? But that, again, the universe wouldn't be able to exist contingently with this thing. Why is it only 13.82 billion years old with this metaphysical principle of optimization or optimism? It should be existing eternally and existing necessary. Those necessary and sufficient conditions are right there. It doesn't have free will. It can't refrain from creating. So the universe have to exist eternally and in a necessary dependent way. If this principle of optimism was in fact the external cause of the universe, the contingent existence of the universe. So yeah, the universe couldn't be contingent. So right away, that's a problem for this. Another problem. So just to properly, I found the quote here that I was looking for from the actual scholars. So what is the principle of optimism or optimization? It makes it is necessary that the best possible world and or worlds must actually exist in order for the optimal overall utility of reality to obtain. So that's what the principle of optimism or optimization does. It ensures that the optimal overall utility of reality is in fact actualized and obtained. Whether that entails there's one best possible world or best possible worlds, plural, then those must exist. That's what the principle says. But in addition, so we provided the one example using Dr. William Lane Craig's argument again that rules this principle of optimism out. But there are other reasons some atheists and Christians have rejected this explanatory option based on the problem of evil. And they'll say, well, this isn't the best possible world, so why did this metaphysical governing principle of optimism create the actual universe that we live in? It shouldn't have. If it's true, then this universe wouldn't have existed based on the problem of evil and suffering or whatever it is. And others have objected to this by saying, well, this isn't the best possible world, and or there is no such thing as a best possible world, so a principle of optimism couldn't exist because there is no best possible world for such a thing to operate and actualize. Obviously, as a traditional Christian theist, I reject this. I don't think that the problem of evil is a good argument for atheism. It's easily defeated, at least in terms of logic and the evidence. If you're irrational and emotional, a lot of atheists tend to be that. The emotional problem of evil is definitely quite strong and persuasive. But we're interested in substance and intellect and truth here, so we can't be governed by irrelevant emotions like an atheist can. We have to go with what's true, and on that front, I don't think the problem of evil would rule out a principle of optimism. There are ways of defeating that. And likewise, I do believe that there is a best possible world. I believe that there's at least two or more of them. And that's best possible worlds are governed by the most number of people freely choosing to be saved as is possible to the maximal compossible degree, or maximizes the overall utility to the greatest compossible degree. So there's the world where God exists alone. There's also this world. Perhaps there are other worlds that have an equal overall utility, of optimal overall utility, I should say. Instead of having some kind of impersonal medical physical principle, obviously we say that's a personal God. Okay, but so apart from these reasons then, is there any other reason that we can rule out this fourth explanatory option of appealing to a metaphysical governing principle like the principle of optimization or optimism? Yes, there is. That Alexander Proust, and this is something that Dr. William Lane Craig gives against conceptual explanations as well. So it kind of, just like a conceptual explanation, governing principles don't stand, abstract governing principles don't stand in causal relations to anything. Not like substances, right? So as Alexander Proust puts it, quote unquote, an abstract principle cannot by itself pull beings into existence as if being pulled out of a metaphysical magical hat. And furthermore, as Dr. William Lane Craig has argued, and I didn't mention it before against conceptual explanations, but this argument applies against both conceptual explanations as well as these governing principle type explanations. Look, trying to envision some sort of abstract or conceptual object or principle just existing, floating in some kind of Platonic realm is simply intelligible. It doesn't make sense for anything to exist that way. In our experience, abstract objects or principles only exist in the minds of people, of persons, of agents with a mind. They exist as thoughts. The laws of logic, the logical law of non-contradiction isn't floating around in some Platonic heaven. Neither are moral principles or aesthetic values and principles or numbers, they don't exist independently. They're simply, they're dependent for their existence on a mind. Who has minds? Only persons or agents have minds. So these things aren't concrete substances. It's unintelligible to think of a principle or some kind of conceptual object or abstract object like a governing principle existing in this way. So to quote Dr. Proust again, he's got some good quotes here, quote unquote, a principle itself must be true of something and true in virtue of something, a substance, a property thing, or a heap, necessarily and inherently, by the essence of what it is, dependent on the existence of something for it to obtain, such as in the mind of God. God's got to exist, and then it exists, these principles or whatever exist as a thought or a value within God or within a mind or something like that, or within someone's nature. So yeah, that's the point here. It doesn't make sense for these things to exist elsewise. Now, the best objection here that I found and really made me laugh a lot is that it's somewhat ironic. Let's pretend that this metaphysical governing principle of optimization or optimism is true. Bada boom, bada bing, thanks you foolish atheists, you've proven that God exists. God proper exists, because it would be optimal. There's a field in philosophy called axiology that my professor Klaas Cray is an expert in. He's well known for this, and he's sort of given various features, and he's proven that axiologically speaking, that's the study of value, it would be more valuable or quote unquote optimal. We would optimize the overall utility if God existed and served as a maximally great being. So thank you. If your principle is true, then that proves that this principle would cause God to exist. So you've proven that God exists. Thanks, atheists. So yeah, I just found that very ironic and very humorous, that even if you want to go down this route, you've proven God. Thank you. But yeah, just to quote somebody smart, just so I'm not, okay, let's quote. So here's one scholar says this, quote unquote, look, Leibniz thought that because there is a God, everything happens for the best, i.e. the principle of optimism is true. But someone like Rgeress, for example, would think the opposite. Everything is for the best, as per the truth of the principle, and so therefore there must be a God. So yeah, that's an interesting kind of comeback to this. It's if you accept it, then you've proven that God exists. So okay, great. So finally, in terms of the personhood or agency of the first cause or the ultimate explanation of the universe, there's one last type of argument, and it turns out to be that I wanted to address, and this comes from philosopher Keith Ward, who's kind of a Thomist. And it comes from his book, The Big Questions in Science and Religion. But he kind of uses the primacy of consciousness argument in quantum physics, whereby some physicists like John Wheeler or Henry Stapp, they kind of see particles like electrons or these fundamental particles as fundamentally being probability waves, that they only collapse into locatable particles when a measurement is taken or some kind of conscious observation is made. And it's on this basis that some scientists today feel that consciousness must be a fundamental aspect of reality itself. And this is what Keith Ward is utilizing here to prove God and to prove the consciousness or personal agency of the universe itself. So this is controversial. An issue here is, well, is consciousness a fundamental aspect of reality, or maybe it's not? Like maybe some form of dual aspect monism or some sort of emergentism of consciousness is true, for example. So this is a controversial thing, but there are some scientists within quantum physics who would say no, consciousness is absolutely fundamental. Everything else, the universe, derives from that. Now, obviously, Keith Ward is saying, great, once you give me consciousness as being primary or having primacy, well, then it follows, well, that's got to be God, right? That's got to be a person and or an agent or a personal being of some sort if it's going to have consciousness. And I agree with him, by the way. But there is controversy here surrounding the nature of the consciousness itself. So great, we have consciousness, but what does that mean? Does that really entail that consciousness would be personal in nature or have agency? Not necessarily entailed by positing some sort of cosmic consciousness, because some people, there are versions of pantheism or panentheism or idealism. There are various Eastern religious conceptions of consciousness that don't necessarily require the personhood or agency of this cosmic consciousness. And I just want to say, on my end, even though I'm not going to argue for it here, but I just think that the notion of there being a consciousness that doesn't entail that it's personal, a personal agent of some sort, is just totally logically absurd and unintelligible. Again, a lot of Anthony 66, Terra, those idealist types, and that pantheist types or whatever, they're not going to be happy with me saying that. But I've researched a lot into this back in the day. One of my favorite books is Keith Ward's Concepts of God book, where he kind of goes into sort of the contradictory or paradoxical nature of various conceptions of God in the different religious traditions, especially the Hinduism and Buddhism and that sort of thing in the beginning of this book. And I've always found it's just unintelligible to say, well, there's consciousness, but it's not a personal or agential consciousness. I think that if you're conscious, that it logically entails that you are personal, or a personal consciousness. So again, I'm not going to go hardcore into that, but that would be needed. I would need to provide argumentation on that if I was going to be using Keith Ward's argument. I would need to establish that personhood and agency is in fact logically entailed when we have consciousness. So I would need to establish that aspect after I've established that consciousness is in fact fundamental feature of reality. So yeah, if Keith Ward's argument is to work, understand there's two aspects. Number one, you've got to establish the primacy of consciousness, that consciousness is indeed a fundamental feature of reality. And then secondly, you need to establish, well, the nature of that entails that it's a personal agent of some sort, of one sort or another. So yeah, with that would establish the argument. Now, like I said, obviously Ward argues based on additional metaphysical grounds that God is the best and simplest candidate, i.e. the best explanation of the cosmic consciousness is one that is personal and has agency. But given the controversial nature that, in the first place, that consciousness is indeed the fundamental feature of our universe and nature and of reality itself, and then secondly, even if it is, what exactly is the nature of that consciousness? What is entailed? Is personhood and agency entailed, given the primacy of consciousness? For that reason, I chose to stay out of it, and I'm not going to utilize this argument as a successful argument, but I wanted to bring it to you guys' attention because it's another way that a lot of Christian theists and apologists go about trying to argue for the personhood or agency of the explanation of the universe, and Keith Ward is a case in point on this front. So yeah, check out his work, as well as others on, like John Polkinghorne, or I think John Lennox as well, argues using this as well. So yeah, check that out. I'm not going to use it in my argument to play it safe and to help out the atheists and skeptics, but that doesn't mean you're limited to not using it. All right, great. So that's it. Those are the arguments establishing the agency or personhood feature of our ultimate explanation of the universe, this external cause. And I think that this is very strong. So I gave it, I was very, very skeptical in trying to help out the atheist against my argument. So the final number I got was 88.45% proven that the necessary first cause of the or ultimate explanation of the universe must involve agent causation through a personal agent of some kind with free will. Okay, so that's it for this feature, thank goodness. Now, one excursus note here. If you remember, before I started the arguments for the personhood and or agency of the first cause or ultimate explanation, I mentioned, well, one avenue we can use subjective properly basic beliefs to prove all of God's attributes. And I said I didn't have a properly basic belief. Well, at this point, I do. Once I've established that the universe is metaphysically or logically necessary, eternal, timeless, spaceless, beginningless, changeless, non-physical or immaterial, and enormously powerful, and that it's personal and is an agent, minimally just one or perhaps tri-personal agent in the case of the Christian God. Nothing so far has restricted us on that front. So that, it could be either or, tri-personal Trinity, or maybe just a unity God or something like that. Either way, it has personhood as one of its properties, and or agency. At this point, now I have a properly basic belief that in the 100% degree that a maximal being exists as the external cause of the universe, i.e. a God, but there's one component missing. For whatever reason, my faculties are messed up due to sin. I don't get a maximal great being versus a maximal evil being. I can't tell in a properly basic way based on this foundation, personal, necessary, spaceless, timeless, blah, blah, blah. And then I don't have a properly basic belief that maximal being is a maximal great, at least not based on that foundation. But I do have one that there is a maximal being. It's either maximally good or maximally evil. But there is some kind of maximal being, even though I can't tell from a properly basic belief on this foundation, based on this derived foundation, what his moral nature or character is. That might not be the case for you. Maybe you can tell, nope, full-on maximal great being God is properly basic for me, given this. Given these features that you've proven after you've given me the personhood and agency, just as Thomas Aquinas put it back in the day, and this is what everybody means by good God, the Christian God, or whatever. You might go way beyond me. I don't get the Christian God in a properly basic way from this foundation, and I don't necessarily get the moral nature of that maximal being from it, but I at least get a maximal being in a properly basic way once I've, through objective argumentation, established this foundation of the properties so far, ending in the personhood. So, yeah, I just wanted to point that out as sort of a bit of a reminder. Don't, keep assessing after we've objectively proven each feature. See if that induces within you some sort of properly basic belief at that point, just as it has for me. It didn't before, but once the personhood was added to the list, then my faculties started functioning in such a way as to produce a properly basic belief about a maximal being, even if it didn't tell me about the moral nature of that maximal being. Okay, great. So what's the next feature we want to look at here? Okay, well, the next one is exactly what I was lacking with my properly basic belief. It is the fact that the cause of the universe must be morally good or morally perfect, as opposed to evil or morally neutral or morally mixed in some way. And I've always heard that the cosmological argument can't speak, and always believed that it can't speak one way or the other. However, through an attached supplemental argument, I've actually changed my mind. But I'm going to withhold. So there are several arguments that philosophers give to demonstrate the moral goodness and or moral perfection of the creator of the universe, just based on the cosmological argument and then some additional argumentation, an attached or supplemental argument. I'm not going to go over those here and now. I know that's going to disappoint you guys, but I'm going to come back to this. But I want to wait until I address my modal ontological argument, because there are four main objections to an ontological argument, the last of which is really the main one that you always see. It's an appeal to some sort of parity that shows that, the modal ontological argument can be parodied, therefore it's a ridiculous or absurd argument and doesn't prove anything. And for me, the main objection is to the first premise of Plantinga and William Lane Craig's version of it is, well, there could be a maximal evil being. So this evil God challenge or evil God parity is the strongest objection to a modal ontological argument. And I'm going to get into that. I'm going to include my assessment of that when I do the modal ontological argument. And as part of my assessment of the evil God challenge, basically there are different ways to meet the challenge or destroy this parity, because by, in the first place, denying what Stephen Law calls the symmetry thesis. So if you demonstrate an asymmetry, and I think there are several asymmetries between a good God and an evil God when it comes to the creation of the universe itself. Now, as I said, I'm not going to get into these because I'm writing my thesis paper, and one of my arguments providing an asymmetry to the evil God challenge is going to be based on an argument that an evil God wouldn't have created the universe and only a good God could have created the universe in the first place. Like I said, there are several other arguments that appeal to, well, the creation of the universe itself proves that the cause that created it must be good. And, some of these, just to give you sort of a brief snapshot, some of these are based on like theories about good being ontologically superior to evil. So some kind of privation theory of the good or privation theory of evil on the other side. They're not symmetrical is what we would be saying. Or perhaps based on considering the axiological qualities of good versus evil, the value. Good is more valuable than evil. And, this is kind of posed in good is kind of a positive property, whereas evil is seen as a negative property. And if you remember when we talked about Richard Swinburne talking about, well, it's simpler for a being to have all of the positive properties. I didn't use that word at the time, but I'm bringing it up now. When we're talking omnipotence, omniscience, all this stuff, these are known as positive properties, where good is positive, whereas evil is seen as a negative property, or lack of impotence is a negative property, or something like that. So yeah, this is what I'm basically just saying. Yeah, there are several arguments based on these types of things, like a privation theory of the good, or looking at the axiological asymmetries between good and evil, showing that one is superior to the other. And in this way, some philosophers have shown, well, it's implausible that the cause of the universe, the creator of the universe, could be an intelligent, evil, personal creator. He has to be a good, personal creator. Several arguments on this. You're going to have to wait for it for now. I know that's disappointing, but I want to do some work on it before I start delivering this. So when I do the modal ontological argument, I'm going to cover this totally fully, including my own creation argument. When I finish my thesis, it's all going to be posted up on the blogs for free for you guys. I always share as much knowledge as I can to help you guys. But just understand, we're going to come back to the cosmological argument and to this feature specifically, and it's going to strengthen our cosmological argument. Once I've done that, we're going to have an additional feature proven in our cumulative case based on our assessment of the evil God parity or evil God challenge during the modal ontological argument investigation. So I think that the reason I want to wait here is, number one, there's things I want to develop further before I present it to you guys. And number two, it's a good illustration of how cumulative case arguments can work. Because, okay, we're delaying it, and now we're going to gain new knowledge when we go to finish the modal ontological argument. And then we're going to see how new knowledge from a different argument can be used within a cumulative case to bolster another argument that we've looked at previously. So it's good for illustration purposes. So yeah, don't get too angry with me, but understand that there are ways, and this surprised me, of demonstrating. I think there are several successful arguments that can demonstrate the goodness, if not moral perfection, of the creator or external cause of the universe. And yeah, I can't wait to present that to you guys once I get the time to get to it. But Yeah, we'll leave it at that for now. We'll just ignore it for now. But bear that in mind. So don't think that if an atheist tells you, or you can't prove whether God is good or evil based on the cosmological argument, he's full of rubbish. He's totally ignorant and he's foolish. And by the way, so was I. I was ignorant because I said this as a Christian theist. I thought this myself until I became educated, but it's not true. There are several lines of argumentation, some more persuasive than others, that can establish the goodness of the first cause or the ultimate explanation, and I can't wait to present that to you guys over the coming months. So, all right, cool. So moving on, another attribute that I'm going to ignore, and is one I don't even believe in, but divine simplicity. There have been various metaphysical type arguments. People like Keith Ward, people of a Thomist persuasion, try to argue for divine simplicity, and by simplicity they don't just mean, like, I believe God isn't composed of parts. He is a very simple being. He's undifferentiated parts. He's not composed of differentiable physical parts or divisible physical parts. He's just one essence, one soul. But I do think that I don't believe in the extreme form of divine simplicity that the arguments usually try to argue for. I don't find them persuasive at all, and I think that they're actually false. I mean, especially as a Christian theist, God is tri-personal. He's three persons. There are three parts, in a sense. They're not divisible. They're not physical. But there are three persons. So right there, that kind of denies divine simplicity in its extreme form. God's properties, his thoughts, these are, again, undivisible, but they're distinct aspects, internal aspects of God. And divine simplicity has to mix up God's existence with his essence and all this stuff. So I don't find the arguments don't work, in my opinion. They're based on philosophical and metaphysical presuppositions that I don't see any evidence or warrant for myself. But these are arguments, if you do accept those things, if you're in a Christian tradition that does accept some of these medieval understandings or metaphysical principles, then maybe you'll find these types of arguments, like what Thomas Aquinas does and stuff, convincing. But yeah, I don't. So I put it as a footnote, and that's it. But I just wanted to mention it so that you guys are aware. There are arguments out there that try to establish the simplicity of the first cause or ultimate explanation of the universe. I don't find any of them persuasive, but be aware of them. Maybe you do, or something like that. Okay, the final aspect is actually a tripartite assessment here. So there are a couple arguments that try to establish, number one, the oneness of the cause of the universe. So it's not a multiplicity of causes or explanations, plural, that explain the universe. And further, and most interesting, that I think the audience is, some people say we can also establish, at the very least, the omnipotence and the omniscience of the first cause and the ultimate explanation. Incredible. Never would have thought that from a cosmological argument. How do we do this? Let's get into this right now. Okay, so the first way to go about this, starting with the oneness aspect, is once again Richard Swinburne and Dr. William Lane Craig, again, experts on this cosmological argument, and essentially they make a simplicity argument based on the criterion of Occam's razor, or the criterion of simplicity. And they will say, well, look, don't posit additional causes beyond what you need to explain the data that you have. One external cause is all that's needed to explain the contingent existence of the universe. So you don't need multiple causes, or polytheism is simpler than polytheism, for example, or one theism is simpler than positing a multiplicity of causes, of personal, timeless, spaceless, blah 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 causes that are all logically and metaphysically necessary. So that's Richard Swinburne, and Dr. William Lane Craig also employs this Occam's razor reasoning, and I think it's successful. I do think that it's simpler, and that Richard Swinburne has an entire chapter in his book, The Existence of God, chapter 3. he goes into detail as to why simplicity arguments make a hypothesis more probable based on its intrinsic probability factor and that sort of thing. In that book, in The Existence of God, chapter 3, if you have that, you can read that. Again, it's not overwhelming, it's not proven beyond reasonable doubt or something, but I think that this factor does make it more probable than that there's a single cause or single being, personal being, that is causing the universe, rather than something else, rather than a multiplicity of beings or persons that cause the universe, personal beings that cause the universe. Now there is a qualification here. So there is one possible objection here that Swinburne addresses, and that's so what atheists and skeptics might say. Well, look, there's so many multiplicity hypotheses that posit some polytheism. There's Canaanite polytheism, there's this polytheism, Hinduism, blah blah blah, or there's this hypothesis that posits a multiplicity of causes of the universe or something like that. And they'll say, look, there's more hypotheses that posit multiple causes than just your one hypothesis of theism, or your handful of hypotheses that are just posit a single cause. Now, just for a moment, let's pretend that's true. Pretend there is much more hypotheses of a multiple nature that compared to hypotheses that posit just a single cause. Well, Richard Swinburne rightly answers, that's complete rubbish. Who cares? The fact is, the single God hypothesis is simpler compared to any and all hypotheses that posit multiple causes for the universe. So who cares how many there are? That's irrelevant. You can have a billion, zillion, 0% probability things, it doesn't matter, or less than 50% proven things that are improbable. They don't add up and make it more likely that one of them is true compared to the single cause hypothesis that we're positing. And he basically presents this. So he says, look, quote unquote, inductive inquiry proves that we always infer and prefer an intrinsically more simple hypothesis because it is more probably true over and above a disjunction of many more complex hypotheses. And he illustrates this with an example of a detective who would never be so foolish as to entertain, without due reason, the notion that, oh, well, there may be one of the 7 billion people on the planet. There's 7 billion people out there, so that so many options that this murder suspect killed my victim with this accomplice, because there's 7 billion accomplice hypotheses out there with 7 billion people, rather than him just doing it alone, when the evidence and the observed data itself makes it equally probable that he either did it himself or he had an accomplice that helped him, an unknown accomplice that helped him. No, the criterion of simplicity demands that the rational detective favors the simpler hypothesis. He did it alone. I have no reason to suspect that he had an accomplice, just because there's 7 billion people on the planet, and I could say, well, I could hypothesize Peter did it, Jane was his accomplice, Jack was his accomplice, and see, I've got 7 billion hypotheses about an accomplice. That outnumbers your one hypothesis about him doing it himself. Therefore, it's more probable that he had an accomplice, one of the 7 billion. No one reasons that way. That's ridiculous. And that's Richard Swinburne's devastating attack against an atheist and a skeptic who might, foolishly try to appeal to it. Well, there's so many more multiplicity hypotheses compared to single cause hypotheses, so therefore probably one of the multiple cause hypotheses is true compared to that one. Utter rubbish when it comes to the criterion of simplicity and how we do inductive inferences and inquiry there. So yeah, I think Swinburne handles that quite effectively. Additionally, Swinburne also gives the issue of, if we posited multiple independent persons as the cause of the universe, with finite attributes or whatever, this raises a problematic nature that Alexander Proust raises too, about the internal, what does he call it? Internal interaction problem. where we wouldn't expect the uniformity of nature. The law of gravity might work on Earth, but it won't work on Mars, and stuff like that. If multiple causes of the universe were disparate, well, maybe this God is going to create Mars with a different law of gravity compared to the God who created Earth and stuff like that. And there has to be an additional explanation to explain why there's this uniformity of nature in creation if it was created by multiple different causes. So there has to be an additional explanation as to why they're united in their goal. If we're not going to posit only one cause, well, why is it the five gods that created the universe are all working together to make a unified creation? That requires an additional explanation, and that's an added layer of complexity. So it's simpler to just say, no, a single entity made it. That's why creation and the universe is uniform in terms of its laws of nature and stuff like that. So there's that argument, and that's an interesting one. Interestingly, though, Alexander proves, I'm not sure if it succeeds, because obviously Christians, we posit three. The universe was created by three personal entities. Obviously, as per the Trinity, it's one being, one united soul, with three sets of cognitive faculties sufficient for personhood, therefore three persons. And in that case, we have an explanation of why they're united and absolutely on the same page, because they're one soul. They really are just one being, and that's what unites them. The point is here, you can see in terms of simplicity, if we have multiple souls, multiple beings that don't even share an essence or share the same being and that sort of thing, what is it that unites them? We need some additional complicated explanation. Maybe this god's more powerful than the next one or something like that. Why are they all totally cooperative in the causing of the existence of the universe, or universe plus, or something like that? Swinburne's argument is, well, the latter is more simple. Positing one single cause is simpler. You don't have to get into questions about, well, why are they united, and why is this collective council of gods or causes united, and stuff like that in terms of their effect that they produce. Okay, so now with Richard Swinburne, that's how we get to the oneness with Richard Swinburne. Additionally, Swinburne also argues for the fact that it's simpler to posit whatever properties this individual single cause of the universe might have, that it holds those properties to the infinite degree. Positing properties as an infinite is simpler than positing, oh well, it has power to a finite degree. It has knowledge to some finite degree. Because anything at a finite degree requires an additional explanation. Well, why that degree as opposed to another one? Whereas infinite ones, they just have an inherent explanation, right? It has the property and nothing's constrained it, so it's got it to the maximal degree. It's full up, so to speak. And a good way of kind of illustrating this type of argument is to picture a gas tank, right? It's a simpler explanation. If somebody's filling up their gas tank, it's simpler to say, well, he filled it to the brim, all the way up to the quote-unquote infinite degree. Obviously, a gas tank's finite, but you get what I'm saying. He did it full. He filled it all the way to the top. But if you say, no, he only did it half full, or if he did it a quarter of the way full, that raises an additional layer of complexity, and it requires additional explanation. Why only half? And we might come back, well, that's all he could afford. He didn't have enough money to fill it up all the way, or something like that. So that's kind of an analogy of how Swinburne's thinking goes here in this regard, as to why it's simpler to think, well, if the cause of the universe is enormously powerful, it has the property of having causal powers, it's simpler to say it's to the powers to the infinite degree. If it has some knowledge because it's a person and it knows how to create a universe, well, it's simpler to say it has all knowledge, that it has knowledge to an infinite degree. And this only works for the properties. The reason why I single out omnipotence and omniscience here, whereas Swinburne doesn't necessarily just talk about these properties, it's because In the first case, it only works for properties that have degrees, right? It doesn't make sense to say, oh, I'm infinitely necessary. There are no degrees. You can't have a degree, possess a property of necessity to a degree. You either have it or you don't. Or eternality. You either have it or you don't. You can't be eternal to a degree or something, 90% eternal or something like that. But with things like power or knowledge, these things do come in degrees. You can have more or less relative to others or that sort of thing. And on that front, I only talk about properties that we can prove through the cosmological argument, either directly and or through the attached supplemental argumentation that attach to the truth of the cosmological argument, nothing else. So basically, there is just the power and knowledge, because we've proven God's a person, an agent who chose to create the universe and therefore has power, has knowledge, at the very least, minimally, the knowledge of how to create the universe. Well, once we get that, then Swinburne's argument takes over and say, well, it's more probable, because it's simpler, that if he's got knowledge, he's got all knowledge. He's omniscient. If he's got some powers, then he's got all powers. He's omnipotent. If you say no, he's finite in that respect, great. Then you're a more complicated hypothesis. Explain why he's constrained. Why does he only have that much knowledge but no more, as opposed to more or less knowledge? Why does he have that much power but no more, as opposed to more or less? So that's how the argument works in a nutshell there. However, if you've been a follower of my show and you've been following the Cosmological Argument series, you'll remember from part 1, oops, Dale, didn't you prove that it's logically that an actual infinite is logically contradictory and it can't exist? Therefore, it's logically impossible for this cause, God or God one hypothesis or whatever you want to propose, for it to have power to an actually infinite degree, or to have knowledge to an actual infinite degree. Those are logically impossible, and you proved that yourself, Dale, in part 1. And in the first place, we have to say, yes, it is logically impossible for God to have an actual infinite amount of knowledge, or to be actually infinitely powerful, or something like that. Otherwise, we're contradicting our earlier arguments, and I don't believe that. God is not an actual infinite. That's logically impossible, even for God. He's not an exception to what we've proven here, logically and metaphysically. But we still say that God's infinite in his qualities and stuff like that. Yes, we do, absolutely. It's not biblical necessarily, but it's consistent with the Bible, and it's the way that Christian theists speak in terms of perfect being theology and that sort of thing. And there's no problem with speaking and saying God is infinite. But we have to understand, technically speaking, God is not actually infinite. We don't mean it literally when speaking in a quantitative sense. There are no quantitative or mathematical actual infinites. But hang on one second. Okay, great. There are no actual infinites, but you did say that there are potential infinites. Remember, represented by that sideways 8, the lemniscate, as opposed to LF null, which is the symbol for the actual infinite, or one of them at least. So what maybe does God have power in the potential quantitative infinite degree, and knowledge in the potential infinite degree, quantitatively speaking? And there again, we have to say no. I don't think that makes sense either. God doesn't have a quantitative degree of knowledge that is potentially infinite, as though it's continuously growing, approaching some kind of ideal limit at infinity or something. So, he's gaining in knowledge every day or something like that. Especially if you think of the cause existing timelessly, that doesn't make any sense at all. Obviously, God is essentially omniscient and omnipotent, so therefore, even without creation or him entering into time with creation, without creation, God was timeless. God was omniscient. He was omnipotent. So positing his properties in this as a potentially infinite degree, that's illogical and doesn't make sense either. So we can't do that. So in that case, obviously God has the properties that he has in the finite degree, to some finite degree, when it's omnipotence or omniscience. Oops, well, isn't that defeat Richard Swinburne's argument? And I think, no, not necessarily, because what we would say, remember that gas tank, that was finite, but we would say the default is it's filled up to the maximal degree, unless there's an additional complication explaining why there's a constraint or restriction as to what finite degree he has. Otherwise, he'll have it to the maximum possible finite degree. Possible just means, the maximum degree that it's possible for God to have it in light of the maximum possible degrees of his other properties that he can have as well. So everything taken together, that's the maximal degree he can possess power or knowledge or something like that. And so say it's like an 8 out of 10 for power and a 9 out of 10 for knowledge. That's the maximum possible degree. It's impossible to get to the 10 out of 10 or something like that. Well, no, let's say it's 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10, that's a finite thing. He's got it to the maximal degree, every property to the maximum possible degree. Assuming that the knowledge doesn't impact the level and make it a 9 out of 10 for power, or vice versa, or something like that. But Eugene Nagasawa is a philosopher who's done a lot of work on this in terms of perfect being theology and the ontological argument, and understanding how God's perfections or divine attributes relate to one another, and the quote-unquote possibility of those various attributes in relation to each other and that sort of thing. So check out his work. He's great on this front. But yeah, so you get the point, right? So God has got it to the finite. Okay, but what about Swinburne's argument then for simplicity? Well, I think it could still work, right? We could still say it's simpler to have it to the maximal possible finite degree as opposed to some lesser finite degree. That requires the additional explanation, right? It's like the gas tank. By default, we inherently expect you filled up your tank. Okay, you filled it up to the brim or to the full tank. If you did less than that, that requires an additional complicated explanation explaining why you were constrained in having the degree of that property instead of having it to the maximal possible degree there. So yeah, that's the argument in a nutshell. So one last thing on this. Okay, great. So I mentioned, but we still say God is infinite, right? In an imprecise sense, we say God's infinite. And what are we talking about there? Well, we mean God is qualitatively, not quantitatively, not mathematically an actual infinite, but he's infinite in a qualitative sense. It's a way, kind of a metaphorical way of saying, like, wow, he's so amazing. He's got all power. He's omnipotent. He's omniscient to the maximal possible degree. He is so amazing. But infinite isn't an independent property of its own right. It's not like if we strip God of everything, he'll have this, of all of his other properties, he'll have this remaining property infinite or something like that. No, we're just using it in a qualitative sense. So just understand, when we say God is infinite, we don't mean he's an actual quantitative and or even a potential. Well, in some cases, he's a potential infinite. Like his existence is potentially infinite, just as ours is, by the way, into the future. We will be existing for all of eternity. That's a potential infinity. So our existence is potentially infinite, though that's not a property. That's a relation, as we saw in part 1 of our show when we described what does it mean to exist. It's not, existence isn't a property. It's a belonging relation. It's a relation that a thing stands in relation to instantiating or exemplifying its properties and that sort of thing. But anyways, the point is, God is not actually infinite in the quantitative sense. He is simply qualitatively infinite. And that's it for this argument. So all right, great. So with that said, we have one last argument, and this one is a bit of a doozy. It's a complicated one by Jerome Gelman, who made the original argument in 2000. Alexander Proust. And if you check out my blog, I've downloaded and I'll be uploading the article by Gelman himself, so you can read it. It's a nice short article, as well as the link to Alexander Proust, who I've sort of taken because he's modified and strengthened Gelman's argument on this front. But it's an argument again for the oneness, which I think is pretty strong, and the omnipotence of the cause of the universe. I'm not sure about the omnipotence part, but the oneness thing seems to work. I really like his argument. It's a complicated one, as I said. You'll need to read over it a couple times. If you go to my blog, I've copied and pasted his argument in his own words, so as to not mess anything up. And I've included the link to Gelman's paper for you guys. Now, it's important to realize, so this argument isn't, at least the way it's stated, isn't necessarily relevant to our version of the cosmological argument. Because remember I mentioned there's different versions of the principle of sufficient reason. And we're using kind of one that's of moderate strength. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Whereas people like Alexander Proust give a slightly stronger one. They're trying to argue every fact, every true proposition has an sufficient reason or explanation of its existence, blah, blah, blah. So this argument, the way it's stated by Proust and Gelman, really talk about explaining contingent truths or true propositions or contingent facts requiring a necessary explanation. Whereas a better argument for us would be about contingent things. And I was having a devil of a time trying to figure out if there would be a way to convert this argument to apply to contingent things. I'm not sure that I have a sufficient understanding of it. There were some bits of how I'm not sure I have a sufficient understanding of it to the point where I'd be able to convert it to apply only to contingent things and it would still be a success. So I'll just kind of briefly go over it, how it works with contingent truths, and see if that can apply to things. But let me just, so basically it starts out with two things. So it says, look, let's pretend N is a necessary being, all of the properties we mentioned above, that explains all the contingent truths of some possible world. And if that's the case, then N is the creator of W. The second thing that you need to know is the iterativeness principle, or postulate, IP. And that just says what I told you guys before. Look, if some entity X has the power to gain the power to do A, then X already has the power to do A, even though X might have to take 2 steps to do A. First acquire the power to directly have the power to do A, before it exercises that power of doing A. So it has to first acquire the power to have the power to do A. That's what this iterativeness postulate is basically saying. And essentially says, look, it follows from the iterativeness postulate that if N is a creator of some world, then the powers of N are necessary properties of N. And he provides a reductio ad absurdum argument to substantiate this. Let's just assume that's the case, because again, it deals with the nature of contingent truths and stuff like that. But here's in a nutshell how the argument, as I understand it, works. So it says, look, so let's pretend there are 2, right? Because this is an argument for the oneness in the first part before we get to the omnipotence. Okay, let's pretend there's N1, and that explains the creation of world 1. Then there's N2, that explains the creation of world 2. Great, so we've got 2 necessary beings, each creating their own worlds. N1 does not create world 2, N2 does not create world 1. So that's the scenario that we have here. But if they are, these things are logically necessary, N1 and N2 both exist in world 1 and world 2, because they're necessary, right? Remember, whatever the cause of the universe is, we proved the contingent universe, it has to be logically or metaphysically necessary. So if we're going to postulate multiple causes, well, that's got to be, those multiple causes both have to be logically or metaphysically necessary, meaning that N1 and both of those causes exist in every possible world. Okay, so if that's the case, well then, if they have the causal powers to create, N2 has the causal powers to create world 1, and N1 has the power to create world 2, but yet they do not create that, What is it that's preventing them from playing a role in creating? It must be the fact that N2 has the power of preventing N1 from creating the world in World 2. By the same token, N1 has the power of preventing N2 from creating World 1. So let me just read the experts, what they say. That'll probably make more sense. So apart from a libertarian explanation, right? So with the case of the Trinity, this would apply where we have persons that have libertarian free will. They have a dual ability. They might refrain from exercising their powers or something like that. But that doesn't necessarily apply to everything or something. So here's what Proust says. So what explains at W1, World 1, we may ask, why it is that N2, the necessary cause number 2, exercised none of its powers to prevent necessary cause 1 from engaging in the kind of activity it engages in World 1? Well, it must be that the explanation lies in the exercise of some power by the necessary cause 1 in World 1. But then if that's the case, then the necessary cause 1 also had this power in World 2 as well. But for some reason, it didn't exercise it in World 2. And its failure to exercise it must be explained by necessary cause number 2's exercise of some preventative power Q. But then once again, if that's the case, then this preventative power of necessary cause 2 is one of the powers that enables N2 to prevent something N1 does in World 1. And so this preventative power of necessary cause 1 includes the power to prevent necessary cause 2 from exercising its preventative powers against it in that world. And we could repeat the argument with the two entities and the worlds swapped, vice versa. So this leads to absolute logical contradiction and absurdity. The only way to avoid this is to conclude that the necessary cause 1 of World 1 and necessary cause 2 of World 2, they both have the power to prevent each other from preventing the other, which I said, again, is logically absurd. So the only solution, is to have, that's not logically absurd, is to posit that, necessary cause 1 is the same, is identical to necessary cause 2. And this goes the same no matter how many multiple entities 500, 600, and necessary causes and worlds and contingent worlds and that sort of thing. So therefore, that's the argument. The only logical way to escape this absurdity is to posit, there's only one necessary cause of all the worlds, and all the necessary causes of every single world that exists, including our universe, is identical to each other. It's God, or the necessary cause of our universe. It's singular. It's just the one person, the one personal being that created the universe. In the case of the Trinity, it's not one person, it's tri-personal, but it's still one soul, one being, one cause. Nice, simple, beautiful, and avoids the logical absurdity of positing multiple separate beings, multiple separate souls or deities or persons that have no ontological essence, shared essence, like the Trinity does in Christianity, for example. So he concludes, look, if N1 is a creator in World 1, N2 is a creator in World 2, then N1 must equal N2. They must be identical. And it also follows that each world has only one creator, the same creator of all the worlds. For if N1 and N2 were each a creator in World 1, then we would choose any second world W2, let N3 be a creator in World 2, and use the above argument to show that, N1 equals N3, N2 equals N3, and so on and so forth. So like I said, it doesn't matter how many creators or causes and worlds you posit, this argument will always show that they're identical. All the necessary causes are identical. Now here's the part where he brings in omnipotence. So he says, look, if there is a unique being that essentially has the power to explain every contingent truth in every world via its causal activity, and if we change contingent truth to contingent thing, I'm not sure if that still works or not, but assuming it does, well then surely having the power to explain every contingent truth and or thing through one's causal activity implies omnipotence. So that's how the argument works. It first gets you the oneness, and then it basically is entailed off of that, given what we define, that it also includes and implies omnipotence of this single necessary cause as well. So that's how the argument works. Like I said, I go to my blog. I've attached Jerome Gelman's full article on this argument, in case it's not making sense to you just listening to me, as well as a link to Alexander Pruse's summarized version of it that I quoted from and was reading here. So, he's a smarter guy than me, so if it didn't make sense the way I put it, listen to him and maybe you can get that. So that's available on my blog for free for you guys. That said, I'm not going to be including this last argument as part of my own assessment, just because there are some ambiguities for me in terms of the translation from applying to explaining contingent truths to contingent things, and whether the argument is still applicable to the latter. Yeah, it's it shows everybody has their own. Some people are smarter than others. I don't think I fully understood this argument. I think a couple years ago when I first read it, it took me a few times to read it, and I was able to get it, but for whatever reason right now, it's just not sinking in. So, I presented the argument for you guys, and I'm providing the links so you guys can investigate it, because obviously, like I said, Jerome Gelman and Alexander Pruse think that this is an argument that is persuasive and worthy of your consideration. I'm not going to include it in my own personal cosmological argument, but I've mentioned it and tried my best, given my best understanding and best efforts, to explain what it is, how it works, and give you guys the resources to investigate it more fully. Hey, if you guys understand the argument fully and it does work for our version of the argument when applied to contingent things and not contingent truths, then yeah, let me know and or include it in your own personal assessments of the cosmological argument. That's great. But due to my intellectual integrity, because of those issues, I'm personally not going to include it right here and right now until I get a firmer grasp on this particular argument. Yeah, nonetheless, I presented it to you. So great. So that's it in terms of my positive case for addressing the gap problem. I think those are the strongest, most persuasive, and or most important supplemental arguments that attach themselves to the truth of our cosmological argument, and which help us establish the relevant properties and attributes of the God One hypothesis as the external cause of the universe, providing that sufficient explanation or reason for its contingent existence. And it gets us quite a lot more than most people realize in terms of the traditional divine attributes of God. It doesn't get us all the way there, but it gets us quite a bit. Especially if you had the properly basic belief, then you've got all of them at that point. But yeah, in terms of just the objective arguments, there's quite a bit more there. We can get goodness. We're going to come back to that. We got the personhood or agency of this necessary ultimate explanation of the universe. There's omnipotence, omniscience. We also the oneness and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think there's more to it than most lay atheists or skeptics dream, right? They kind of, like someone like T-Jump, he just thinks, oh, well, I'm going to posit a necessary pineapple. Total rubbish, but he thinks that's all that the cosmological argument or the argument from contingency gets you, is some necessary cause of the universe. And no, there's so much more to it when you actually look at what the experts who address the gap problem come up with. That said, that's the positive side, though. What about the negative side that is related to this gap problem? Okay, so I'm going to end it off here because this is part 5 was a very long show. It's about 4 hours, just slightly over 4 hours long. So yeah, I'm going to have to break this up into 2 parts, parts 5A and 5B. So yeah, I'll post up 5B within a day or so of posting up part 5A here, and we'll pick up, I'll put in about a minute or so of the show that you've already heard, and then we'll pick up right where we left off from here and continue on until the end of the show. So yeah, I just want to break it up because it is, a 4-hour show is just way too long. So yeah, I'm going to stop it here. And look out for part 5B to be posted in a couple days. All right, take care.